Chapter 7. Memory. Constructing and reconstructing our pasts. Learning objectives. 7.1a. Identify the ways that memories do and don't accurately reflect experiences. 7.1b. Explain the function, span, and duration of each of the three memory systems. 7.1c. Differentiate the subtypes of long-term memory. 7.2a. Identify methods for connecting new information to existing knowledge. 7.2b. Identify the role that schemas play in the storage of memories. 7.2c. Distinguish ways of measuring memory. 7.2d. Describe how the relation between encoding and retrieval conditions influences remembering. 7.3a. Describe the role of long-term potentiation in memory. 7.3b. Distinguish different types of amnesia and the relevance of amnesia to the brain's organization of memory. 7.3c. Identify the key impairments of Alzheimer's disease. 7.4a. Identify how children's memory abilities change with age. 7.5a. Identify factors that influence people's susceptibility to false memories and memory errors. 7.5b. Describe some of the real-world implications of false memories and memory errors. The video conveys a powerful message. Our memories are far from perfect and are sometimes far off the mark. Now test yourself and try your hand, or your memory, that is, at a similar exercise that requires only a pen or pencil and a sheet of paper. For maximum effect, you may want to try this demonstration along with a group of friends. Read the list of words below, taking about a second per word. Read the left column first, then the middle column, then the right. Ready? Okay, begin. Bed, pillow, tired, darkness, cot, dream, snore, blanket, sheets, rest, yawn, couch. Now turn away and take a minute or so to jot down as many of these words as you can recall. Did you remember couch? If so, give yourself a point. How about snore? If so, good. Give yourself another point. Okay, how about sleep? If you're like about a third of typical people, you remembered seeing the word sleep. But now take a close look at the list. The word sleep isn't there. Now you have a good grasp of the amazement that some of the people interviewed in the video experienced when they were confronted with the imperfections of their memories. If you or your friends remembered seeing sleep on the list, you experienced a memory illusion, a false but subjectively compelling memory. Like visual illusions, most memory illusions are byproducts of our brain's generally adaptive tendency to go beyond the information available to it. By doing so, our brain helps us make sense of the world, but it sometimes leads us astray. As the interviewer explained in the video, you may have remembered seeing the word sleep because it was linked closely in meaning to the other words on the list, such as bed, dream, and rest. As a consequence, you may have been fooled into remembering that the word sleep was there. By relying on the representativeness heuristic, CLO 8.1a, like goes with like. We simplify things to make them easier to remember. In this case, though, our use of this handy heuristic comes with a modest price: a memory illusion. 7.1. How memory operates. The memory assembly line. 7.1a. Identify the ways that memories do and don't accurately reflect experiences. 7.1b. Explain the function, span, and duration of each of the three memory systems. 7.1c. Differentiate the subtypes of long-term memory. We can define memory as the retention of information over time. We have memories for many kinds of information, ranging from our 16th birthday party to how to ride a bike to the shape of a pyramid. Our memories work pretty well most of the time. Odds are high that tomorrow you'll find your way into school or work just fine, and that, with a little luck, you'll even remember some of what you read in this chapter. Yet in other cases, our memories fail us, often when we least expect it. How many times have you misplaced your keys or cell phone, or forgotten the names of people you've met over and over again? We call this seeming contradiction the paradox of memory. Our memories are surprisingly good in some situations and surprisingly poor in others. The paradox of memory. To a large extent, this chapter is the story of this paradox. As we'll see, the answer to the paradox of memory hinges on a crucial fact. The same memory mechanisms that serve us well in most circumstances can sometimes cause us problems in others. When our memories serve us well. Research shows that our memories are often astonishingly accurate. Most of us can recognize our schoolmates decades later and recite the lyrics to dozens, even hundreds of songs. Consider a study in which college students viewed 2,560 photographs of objects or scenes for a few seconds each. 3 days later, the researchers showed these students each original photograph paired with a new one. Remarkably, the students correctly picked out the original photographs 93% of the time. In another case, a researcher contacted participants 17 years after they'd viewed more than 100 line drawings for 1 to 3 seconds in a laboratory study. They identified these drawings at better than chance rates compared with participants who'd never seen the drawings. The memories of a small subset of individuals with a condition known as autism spectrum disorder, autism, are even more astonishing. Contrary to popular misconception, most individuals with autism lack specialized memory abilities, but there are impressive exceptions. Take the case of Kim Peek, who was the inspiration for the 1998 Academy Award-winning film Rain Man. Peek died in 2009. Peek's IQ was 87, noticeably below the average of approximately 100. Yet Peek memorized about 12,000 books word for word, the zip codes of every town in the United States, and the number of every highway connecting every city in the United States. Kim Peek was also a calendar calculator. If you gave him any past or future date, like October 17th, 2094, he'd give you the correct day of the week in a matter of seconds. Not surprisingly, Kim earned the nickname of Kim-puter among researchers who studied his astonishing memory feats. Yet it's not only people with autism who possess remarkable memory capacities. Consider the case of Rajan Mahadevan, better known simply as Rajan, now a lecturer in the psychology department of the University of Tennessee. Rajan's memory feats are so spectacular that they were spoofed on an episode of the cartoon show The Simpsons. Rajan had somehow managed to memorize the number pi, the ratio of a circle's diameter to its radius, to a remarkable 38,811 digits. See Figure 7.1. When he recited them, it took him 3 hours at a rate of more than 3 digits per second. By the way, if you're curious, the world record for remembering pi is now up to more than 80,000 digits. How did Rajan pull off this amazing feat? We'll find out later in the chapter. Yet Rajan also provides a wonderful illustration of the paradox of memory. Despite finding pi to be a piece of cake, he kept forgetting the location of the men's restroom at the University of Minnesota Psychology Department, even though it was just down the hall from where he'd been tested repeatedly. What would it be like if we could somehow remember almost everything we ever experienced? Would this talent be a blessing, a curse, or perhaps a mix of both? Consider the fascinating case of a woman in her 40s, known only by the initials AJ, who has such an astounding memory that she's left even seasoned psychological researchers shaking their heads in bewilderment. Although emotionally quite normal, AJ is markedly abnormal in one way. She remembers just about everything she's ever experienced. When given a date, like March 17th, 1989, she can report precisely what she was doing on that day, taking a test, eating dinner with a good friend, or traveling to a new city. The claims here are extraordinary, but they've now been confirmed by research. Scientists have confirmed that she's almost always right. Moreover, she remembers on what day of the week that date fell. In 2003, a team of investigators asked AJ to remember all of the dates of Easter over the past 24 years. She got all but 2 correct and reported accurately what she'd done each day. AJ, like about a dozen other people identified thus far, suffers from an exceedingly rare condition called hypothymastic syndrome, memory of life events that's too good. Or does she really suffer? It's not entirely clear because she regards her remarkable memory as both a curse and a blessing. AJ says that she sometimes remembers painful events that she'd prefer to forget, but also that she'd never want to give up her special memory gift. As to the causes of hypothymastic syndrome, scientists are baffled. Nevertheless, recent research suggests subtle differences in brain structure between people with and without this condition, especially involving brain regions involved in autobiographical memory. In a very real sense, we are our memories. Our memories define not only our past, but also our sense of identity. For AJ, life is like a movie in her mind that never stops, as she puts it. Her recollections of her life and interactions with friends are remarkably vivid and emotionally intense. AJ's memory has shaped her personality in profound ways. When our memories fail us. In some exceedingly rare cases, as with AJ, memory is virtually perfect. Many others of us have extremely good memories in 1 or 2 narrow domains, like art history, baseball batting averages, or Civil War trivia. Yet memory can be surprisingly malleable and prone to error, as we learned from the video and the memory exercise we completed. The reconstructive nature of memory. These 2 demonstrations drive home a crucial point. Our memories frequently fool us and fail us. Indeed, a central theme of this chapter is that our memories are far more reconstructive than reproductive. When we try to recall an event, we actively reconstruct our memories using the cues and information available to us. We don't passively reproduce our memories, as we would if we were downloading information from the internet. Remembering is largely a matter of patching together our often fuzzy recollections with our best hunches about what really happened. When we recall our past experiences, we rarely, if ever, reproduce precise replicas of them. We should, therefore, be skeptical of claims that certain vivid memories or even dreams are exact photocopies of past events. In fact, it's easy to show that our memories are often reconstructive. After reading this sentence, close your eyes for a few moments and picture your most recent walk along a beach, lake, or pond. Then, after opening your eyes, ask yourself what you saw. Did you see yourself as if from a distance, as an outside observer would? Many people report this visual perspective. As Sigmund Freud noted well over a century ago, such memories provide an existence proof, CLO 2.2a, that at least some of our memories are reconstructive. You couldn't possibly have seen yourself from a distance, because you don't see yourself when you look at your surroundings. You must have constructed that memory rather than recalled it in its original form. Interestingly, Asians are more likely than European Americans to see themselves at a distance in such memories. This result fits with findings that members of many Asian cultures are more likely than members of Western cultures to adopt others' perspectives. See LO 1.1a. So our memories are probably shaped by not only our hunches and expectations, but also by our cultural backgrounds. How can our memories be so good in some cases and so bad in others? How can we explain both the astonishing memories of people like AJ and Rajan and the far from perfect memories of most of us? To grasp the paradox of memory, we need to figure out how some of our experiences make it into our memories, whereas so many others never do. To do so, let's embark on a guided tour of the factory assembly line inside our heads. The three systems of memory. Up to this point, we've been talking about memory as though it were a single thing. It isn't. Traditionally, most psychologists have distinguished among three major systems of memory: sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory, as depicted in Figure 7.2. These systems serve different purposes and vary along at least two important dimensions: span, how much information each system can hold, and duration, over how long a period of time that system can hold information. In reality, the distinctions among these three memory systems aren't always clear-cut. Moreover, many modern researchers suspect that there are more than three memory systems. For the sake of simplicity, we'll begin by discussing the three systems model, although we'll point out some ambiguities along the way. We can think of these three systems much like different factory workers along an assembly line. The first system, sensory memory, is tied closely to the raw materials of our experiences, our perceptions of the world. It holds these perceptions for just a few seconds or less before passing some of them onto the second system. This second system, short-term memory, works actively with the information handed to it, transforming it into more meaningful material before passing some of it onto the third system. Short-term memory holds on to information longer than sensory memory does, but not much longer. The third and final system, long-term memory, permits us to retain important information for minutes, days, weeks, months, or even years. In some cases, the information in long-term memory lasts for a lifetime. The odds are high, for example, that you'll remember your first kiss and your high school graduation for many decades, perhaps until the last day of your life. As you can tell from our use of the word some in the previous sentences, we almost always lose a great deal of information at each relay station in the memory assembly line. Sensory memory. If you're anywhere near a television set, turn it on for 10 seconds or so. Alternatively, on your computer or smartphone, watch the first 10 seconds of a video. What did you see? Regardless of what program or video you were watching, you almost certainly experienced a steady and uninterrupted stream of visual information. In reality, that continuous stream of images was an illusion, because television programs and movies consist of a series of disconnected frames, each separated by an extremely brief interlude of darkness you can't perceive. Yet your brain sees these frames as blending together into a seamless whole, in part because it continues to detect each frame for an extremely brief period of time after it disappears. That is, our brains retain each frame in our sensory memory, the first factory worker in the assembly line of memory. Sensory memory briefly maintains our perceptions in a buffer area before passing them on to the next memory system, which is short-term memory. Sensory memory is a helpful system because it buys our brains a bit of extra time to process incoming sensations. It also allows us to fill in the blanks in our perceptions and see the world as an unbroken stream of events. Psychologists believe that each sense, including vision, hearing, touch, taste, and smell, uses its own form of sensory memory. In the case of television, film, or YouTube clips, for example, we experience an iconic memory, the type of sensory memory that applies to vision. Iconic memories last for only about a second, and then they're gone forever. Psychologist George Sperling, 1960, conducted a pioneering study that demonstrated the existence of iconic memory. He quickly flashed participants a display of 12 letters, with 4 letters arranged in 3 rows, as shown in Figure 7.3. The display lasted only about 1/20th of a second, and participants had to recall as many letters within the display as they could. Sperling found that most participants could recall only 4 or 5 letters. Surprisingly, different participants remembered different letters. This finding suggested to Sperling that all 12 letters had an equal chance of being recalled, but that no one person could recall them all. This finding was puzzling. After all, if participants had remembered the whole visual display, why could they recall only a handful of letters and no more? To find out, Sperling experienced a flash of insight, pun intended. Immediately after he flashed the 12 letters, he presented a tone, high, medium, or low, to signal participants which of the 3 rows, top, middle, or bottom, to report. Then he randomly instructed participants to report only one of the 3 rows. When he used this technique, he found that virtually all participants now got almost all letters in that row correct. This finding confirmed Sperling's hunch. Participants had access to all 12 letters in their memories. Sperling concluded that our iconic memories fade so quickly that we can't access all the information before it disappears. So Sperling's participants were able to take in all of the information, but retained it in memory only long enough to read off a few letters. Iconic memory may help to explain the remarkable and exceedingly rare phenomenon of eidetic imagery, popularly called photographic memory. People with eidetic memory, most of them children, can supposedly hold a visual image in their minds with such clarity that they can describe it perfectly or almost perfectly. See Figure 7.4. Some psychologists believe that eidetic memory reflects an unusually long persistence of the iconic image in some fortunate people. Nevertheless, it's not clear that any memories are truly photographic, because even these memories often contain minor errors, such as information that wasn't in the original visual stimulus. More likely, people with eidetic memories are blessed with excellent, although not perfect, recollections. Sensory memory applies to hearing too. Now read that last sentence aloud. Sensory memory applies to hearing too. If you pause for a few moments after saying it, you'll be able to replay the words precisely as you heard them for a few seconds, much like a soft echo reverberating from a mountaintop. That's why psychologists call this form of sensory memory echoic memory. In contrast to iconic memories, echoic or auditory memories can last as long as 5 to 10 seconds, conveniently permitting you to take notes on your psychology professor's most recent sentence, even after he or she has finished saying it. Interestingly, there's also some evidence of eidetic memories for hearing, in which a few fortunate individuals report that their echoic memories persist for unusually long periods of time. Now, wouldn't that make taking lecture notes a breeze? Short-term memory. Once information makes it past our sensory buffers, it moves into our short-term memory, a second system for retaining information in our memories for brief periods of time. Short-term memory is the second factory worker in our memory assembly line. One key component of short-term memory is what psychologists call working memory, which refers to our ability to hold on to information we're currently thinking about, attending to, or processing actively. If sensory memory is what feeds raw materials into the assembly line, short-term memory is the workspace where construction happens. After construction takes place, we either move the product into the warehouse for long-term storage, or, in some cases, scrap it altogether. The duration of short-term memory. If short-term memory is a short stop on the assembly line, just how brief is it? In the late 1950s, a husband and wife team decided to find out. Lloyd and Margaret Peterson, 1959, presented participants with lists of 3 letters each, such as MKP or ASN, and then asked them to recall these 3-letter strings. In some cases, they made participants wait only 3 seconds before recalling the letters. In other cases, they made them wait up to 18 seconds. Each time they asked participants to count backward by 3s while they were waiting. Many psychologists were surprised by the Petersons' results. And you may be too. They found that after about 10 or 15 seconds, most participants did no better than chance. So the duration of short-term memory is quite brief. It's probably no longer than about 20 seconds. Some researchers believe it's even shorter than that, perhaps even less than 5 seconds, because some participants in the Peterson and Peterson study may have been able to silently rehearse the letters even when counting backward. Incidentally, many people misuse the term short-term memory in everyday language. For example, they may say that their short-term memory isn't working because they forgot what they had for dinner yesterday. As we've seen, the duration of short-term memory is far briefer than that. Memory loss from short-term memory. Decay versus interference. Why did the Petersons' participants lose their short-term memories so quickly, just as we quickly lose our memories of names of people we've just met or phone numbers we've just heard? The most obvious explanation is that short-term memories decay, that is, fade away over time. The longer we wait, the less is left. Yet there's a competing explanation for the loss of information from short-term memory: interference. According to this view, our memories get in the way of each other. That is, our memories are very much like radio signals. They don't change over time, but they're harder to detect if they're jammed by other signals. As it turns out, there's evidence for both decay and interference. Recent physiological evidence for decay comes from research suggesting that the birth of new neurons in the hippocampus leads to the decay of memories in that brain region. As we create new memories, our old ones gradually fade away. Nevertheless, there's even stronger evidence for the role of interference in memory loss. For example, 2 investigators, Waugh and Norman, 1965, presented participants with many different lists of 16 digits, such as 6, 2, 7, 1, 8, 5, 3, 4, 2, 6, 9, 7, 4, 5, 8, 3. Right after participants saw each list, the researchers gave them 1 target digit to focus on, and then asked participants which digit came after this target digit. In all cases, this target digit appeared twice in the list, and participants had to remember the digit that came after its first presentation in the list. In the preceding digit list, the target item might be 8, so we'd search for the first 8 in the list, and the correct response would be 5. As an ingenious means of ruling out alternative hypothesis, the experimenters manipulated 2 variables to figure out which of them influenced forgetting. Specifically, they manipulated 1. where in the list the target digit appeared, early or late, and 2. How rapidly they presented digits to participants, either quickly, 1 digit every second, or slowly, 1 digit every 4 seconds. They told participants to listen carefully to each digit, but not to rehearse it mentally. Now, if decay were the principal culprit in forgetting, participants' performance should become worse when researchers read the list slowly, because more time had passed between digits. In contrast, if interference were the principal culprit, participants' performances should become worse when the target digit appeared later rather than earlier in the list, regardless of speed, because memory for later digits is hampered by memory for earlier digits. The results showed that interference is the major contributor to forgetting. Participants' forgetting is due almost entirely to where in the list the target digit appears, rather than to the speed of presentation. Still, most researchers believe that both decay and interference play some role in short-term memory loss. We're not quite done with our examination of interference yet, because it turns out that there are 2 different kinds of interference. One kind, retroactive interference, occurs when learning something new hampers earlier learning. The new interferes with the old. Think of the prefix retro, because retroactive interference works in a reverse direction. If you've learned one language, say Spanish, and then later learned a somewhat similar language, perhaps Italian, you probably found that you started making mistakes in Spanish you'd never made before. Specifically, you may have found yourself using Italian words like buono for Spanish words like bueno. Both buono and bueno mean good. In contrast, proactive interference occurs when earlier learning gets in the way of new learning. The old interferes with the new. For example, knowing how to play tennis might interfere with our attempt to learn to play racquetball, which requires a much smaller racket. Not surprisingly, both retroactive and proactive interference are more likely to occur when the old and new stimuli that we've learned are similar. Learning a new language doesn't much affect our ability to master a new spaghetti recipe. The capacity of short-term memory. The magic number. We've already seen that short-term memory doesn't last very long, 20 seconds or even less, and poof, the memory is gone, unless we've made an extra special effort to retain it. But how large is the span of short-term memory? Try reading each of the following rows of numbers, 1 row at a time, at a rate of 1 number per second. Once you're done with each row, close your eyes and try writing down what you remember. Ready? Okay, begin. 9, 5, 2. 2, 9, 7, 3. 5, 7, 4, 9, 2. 6, 2, 7, 3, 8, 4. 2, 4, 1, 8, 6, 4, 7. 3, 9, 5, 7, 4, 1, 8, 9. 8, 4, 6, 3, 1, 7, 4, 2, 5. 5, 2, 9, 3, 4, 6, 1, 8, 5, 7. You've just taken a test of digit span. How did you make out? Odds are that you breezed through 3 digits, started to find 4 digits a bit tricky, and maxed out at somewhere between 5 and 9 digits. It's unlikely you got the 10-digit list completely right. If you did, you've earned the right to call yourself a memory superstar. That's because the digit span of most adults is between 5 and 9 digits, with an average of 7 digits. Indeed, this finding is so consistent that psychologist George Miller, 1956, referred to 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information as the magic number. According to Miller, the magic number is the universal limit of short-term memory, and it applies to just about all information we encounter: numbers, letters, people, vegetables, and cities. Because it's hard to retain much more than 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information in our short-term memory, it's almost surely not a coincidence that telephone numbers in North America are exactly 7 digits long, not counting the area code. Some European numbers are slightly longer, but few exceed 9, the typical upper limit for the magic number. Some psychologists have since argued that Miller's magic number overestimates the capacity of short-term memory, and that the true magic number is as low as 3 or 4. Regardless of who's right, it's clear that the capacity of short-term memory is extremely limited. Chunking. If our short-term memory capacity is no more than 9 digits, and perhaps much less, how do we manage to remember much larger amounts of information than this for brief periods of time? Read the following sentence, then wait a few seconds and recite it back to yourself. Harry Potter's white owl Hedwig flew off into the dark and stormy night. Were you able to remember most or even all of it? The odds are high that you were, yet this sentence contained 13 words, which exceeds the magic number. How did you accomplish this feat? We can expand our ability to remember things in the short term by using a technique called chunking, organizing material into meaningful groupings. For example, look at the following string of 15 letters for a few seconds, and then try to recall them. K, A, C, F, J, N, A, B, I-S, B-C, F-U-I. How did you do? Odds are you didn't do too well, probably right around the magic number, that is, only a subset of the letters listed. Okay, now try this 15-letter string. C-I-A, U-S-A, F-B-I, N-B-C, J-F-K. Did you do any better this time? It's the same 15 letters, but you probably noticed something different about this group than the first group. They consisted of meaningful abbreviations. So you probably chunked these 15 letters into 5 meaningful groups of 3 letters each: CIA, USA, FBI, NBC, JFK. In this way, you reduced the number of items you needed to remember from 15 to only 5. In fact, you might have gotten this number down to less than 5 by combining CIA and FBI, both the initials of U.S. government intelligence agencies, into one chunk. Consider this amazing feat. After 2 years of training, one man, named SF, was able to get his digit span memory up to 79 digits using chunking. Among other tricks, SF, who was a runner, memorized enormous numbers of world record times for track events and used them to chunk numbers into bigger units. Yet SF hadn't really increased his short-term memory capacity at all, only his chunking ability. His memory span for letters was only a measly 6, well within the range of the magic number achieved by the rest of us memory stackers. Chunking also explains how Rajan performed his remarkable pi memorization feats. He memorized enormous numbers of area codes, dates of famous historical events, and other meaningful numbers embedded within the list of pi digits to effectively reduce more than 30,000 digits to a much smaller number. Experts rely on chunking to help them recall complicated information. For example, chess masters recall realistic chess positions far better than do novices, yet do no better than novices at recalling random chess positions, suggesting that experts organize meaningful chess positions into broader patterns. Rehearsal. Whereas chunking increases the span of short-term memory, a strategy called rehearsal extends the duration of information in short-term memory. Rehearsal is repeating the information mentally or even aloud. In that way, we keep the information alive in our short-term memories, just as jugglers keep a bunch of bowling pins alive by continuing to catch them and toss them back into the air. Of course, if they pause for a second to scratch their nose, the bowling pins come crashing to the ground. Similarly, if we stop rehearsing and shift our attention elsewhere, we'll quickly lose material from our short-term memory. There are two major types of rehearsal. The first, maintenance rehearsal, simply involves repeating the stimuli in their original form. We don't attempt to change the original stimuli in any way. We engage in maintenance rehearsal whenever we hear a phone number and keep on repeating it, either aloud or in our minds, until we're ready to dial the number. In this way, we keep the information alive in our short-term memory. Of course, if someone interrupts us while we're rehearsing, we'll forget the number. The second type of rehearsal, elaborative rehearsal, usually takes more effort. In this type of rehearsal, we elaborate on the stimuli we need to remember by linking them in some meaningful way, perhaps by visualizing them or trying to understand their interrelationship. To grasp the difference between maintenance and elaborative rehearsal, let's imagine that a researcher gave us a paired associate task. In this task, the investigator presents us with various pairs of words, such as dog, shoe, tree, pipe, key, monkey, and kite, president. Then he or she presents us with the first word in each pair, dog, tree, and so on, and asks us to remember the second word in the pair. If we used maintenance rehearsal, we'd simply repeat the words in each pair over and over again as soon as we heard it. Dog, shoe, dog, shoe, dog, shoe, and so on. In contrast, if we used elaborative rehearsal, we'd try to link the words in each pair in a meaningful way. One effective way of accomplishing this goal is to come up with a meaningful, perhaps even absurd, visual image that combines both stimuli. See Figure 7.5. Research shows that we're especially likely to remember the two stimuli if we picture them interacting in some fashion. That's probably because doing so allows us to chunk them into a single integrated stimulus. So to remember the word pair dog-rocket, for example, we could picture a dog piloting a rocket ship, or a rocket ship barking like a dog. Elaborative rehearsal usually works better than maintenance rehearsal. This finding demolishes a widely held misconception about memory, that rote memorization is typically the best means of retaining information. There's a take-home lesson here when it comes to our study habits. To remember complex information, it's almost always better to connect that information with things we already know than to merely keep repeating it. Depth of processing. This finding is consistent with a levels of processing model of memory. See video. According to this model, the more deeply we process information, the better we tend to remember it. This information identifies 3 levels of processing of verbal information: visual, phonological, sound-related, and semantic, meaning-related. Visual processing is the most shallow, phonological, somewhat less shallow, and semantic, the deepest. To understand the differences among these 3 levels, try to remember the following sentence. All people create their own meaning of life. If you relied on visual processing, you'd hone in on how the sentence looks. For example, you might try to focus on the fact that the sentence consists entirely of capital letters. If you relied on phonological processing, you'd focus on how the words in the sentence sound. Most likely, you'd repeat the sentence again and again until it began to sound boringly familiar. Finally, if you relied on semantic processing, you'd emphasize the sentence's meaning. You might elaborate on how you've tried to create your own meaning of life and how doing so has been helpful to you. Research shows that deeper levels of processing, especially semantic processing, tend to produce more enduring long-term memories. Still, some psychologists have charged the levels of processing model with being largely unfalsifiable. According to them, it's virtually impossible to determine how deeply we've processed a memory in the first place, so we could never independently test the claim that more deeply processed memories are better remembered. Moreover, critics claim that proponents of the levels of processing model are merely equating depth with how well participants later remember. There may well be some truth to this criticism. Still, it's safe to say that the more meaning we can supply to a stimulus, the more likely we are to recall it in the long term. Long-term memory. Now that the second factory assembly line worker, short-term memory, has finished her construction job, what does she pass on to the third and final worker? And how does what the third worker receives differ from what the second worker started out with? Long-term memory, the third worker, is our relatively enduring store of information. It includes the facts, experiences, and skills we've acquired over our lifetimes. Differences between long-term and short-term memory. Long-term memory differs from short-term memory in several important ways. First, in contrast to short-term memory, which can typically hold at most 7 to 9 stimuli in hand at a single time, the capacity of long-term memory is huge. Just how huge? No one knows for sure. Some scientists estimate that a typical person's memory holds about as much information as 500 huge online encyclopedias, each about 1,500 pages long. So if someone praises you on your encyclopedic memory, accept the compliment. They're probably right. Second, although information in short-term memory vanishes after only about 20 seconds at most, and probably less, information in long-term memory often endures for years, even decades, and sometimes permanently. Consider the work of psychologist Harry Barrick, who has studied individuals' memory for languages they learned in school over many decades. In Figure 7.6, we can see that people's memory declines markedly about 2 to 3 years after taking a Spanish course. Yet after about 2 years, the decline becomes quite gradual. Indeed, it begins to level out after a while, with almost no additional loss for up to 50 years after they took the course. Barrick referred to this kind of long-term memory, which remains frozen over time, as permastore, as an analogy to the permafrost found in the Arctic or Antarctic that never melts. Third, the types of mistakes we commit in long-term memory usually differ from those we make in short-term memory. Long-term memory errors tend to be semantic, that is, based on the meaning of the information we've received. So we might misremember a poodle as a terrier. In contrast, short-term memory errors tend to be acoustic, that is, based on the sound of the information we've received. So we might misremember hearing noodle rather than poodle. Primacy and recency effects. When we try to remember a large number of items, such as a grocery list or a schedule of events, we often forget some of them. To some extent, psychologists can predict which items we're more likely to forget and which we're more likely to remember. To demonstrate this point, read the list of 20 words either to yourself or aloud. Read the left column first, then the middle column, then the right one. Then turn away and take a few minutes to try to recall as many of these words as you can in any order you'd like. Ready? Begin. Ball, shoe, tree, dog, paper, bird, house. Sky, desk, car, rope, dress, xylophone, knife. Store, pencil, grass, man, cloud, hat, vase. If you're like most people, you probably did a bit better with the early words, like ball, shoe, and tree, than with the words in the middle of the list. That's the primacy effect, the tendency to remember stimuli, like words, early in a list. Also, you may have done a bit better with the later words, like cloud, hat, and vase. That's the recency effect, the tendency to remember stimuli later in a list. As an aside, there's a decent chance you remembered the word xylophone, which seems to be something of an oddball in the list. That's because we tend to remember stimuli that are distinctive in some way. If we averaged your results along with those of a few hundred other participants, we'd end up with the graph depicted in Figure 7.7, called the serial position curve. As we can see, this curve clearly displays the primacy and recency effects. Most researchers agree that primacy and recency effects reflect the operation of different memory systems. Because the last few words in the list were probably lingering in your short-term memory, you were probably especially likely to recall them. So the recency effect seems to reflect the workings of short-term memory. What explains the primacy effect? This one is trickier, but there's good evidence that you were more likely to recall the earlier words in the list because you had more opportunity to rehearse them silently, and perhaps even to chunk them. As a consequence, these words were more likely to be transferred from short-term memory into long-term memory, so the primacy effect seems to reflect the operation of long-term memory. Types of long-term memory. As we mentioned earlier, some psychologists argue that there are actually more than 3 memory systems. In particular, they claim that long-term memory isn't just one system, but many. To find out why, try your hand at the following 4 questions. 1. In what year did the United States become independent from Great Britain? 2. What Republican candidate for president did Barack Obama defeat in the 2012 U.S. election? 3. How old were you when you first tried to ride a bicycle? 4. Where did you celebrate your last birthday? According to Endel Tulving, 1972, and many other memory researchers, our answers to the first 2 questions rely on different memory systems than our answers to the last 2. Our answers to the first 2 questions, 1776 and Mitt Romney, depend on semantic memory, our knowledge of facts about the world. In contrast, our answers to the last 2 questions, which are unique to us, depend on episodic memory, our recollection of events in our lives. AJ, whom we discussed at the beginning of the chapter, experiences remarkably accurate episodic memories. There's good evidence that these 2 types of memory are housed in different brain regions. Semantic memory tends to activate the left frontal cortex more than the right frontal cortex, and vice versa for episodic memory. Still, common neural pathways may bring together semantic and episodic memories regardless of their content. Semantic and episodic memory both require conscious effort and awareness. Whether we're trying to recall the definition of chunking from earlier in this chapter or our first kiss, we know we're trying to remember. Moreover, when we recall this information, we have a conscious experience of accessing it. That is, both semantic and episodic memory are examples of explicit memory, the process of recalling information intentionally. Some researchers refer to the information recalled by explicit memory as declarative memory. Explicit memory differs from implicit memory, the process of recalling information we don't remember deliberately. Implicit memories don't require conscious effort on our part. For example, each of us can go through the steps of unlocking our front doors without consciously recalling the sequence of actions required to do so. In fact, we probably can't tell without reenacting it in our heads or actually standing in front of our doors which way the key turns in the lock and how we hold the key in our hands while unlocking the door. Studies of people with brain damage provide remarkable existence proofs, CLO 2.2a, for the distinction between implicit and explicit memory. Antonio Damasio, 2000, has studied a patient named David whose left and right temporal lobes were largely obliterated by a virus. David has virtually no explicit memory for anyone he's met. When Damasio shows him photographs of people with whom he's recently interacted, he can't recognize any of them. Yet when Damasio asks David which of these people he'd ask for help if he needed it, he points to those who've been kind to him, utterly clueless of who they are. David has no explicit memory for who's helped him, but his implicit memory remains intact. To make matters still more complicated, there are several subtypes of implicit memory. We'll focus on two here: procedural memory and priming. However, according to most psychologists, implicit memory also includes habituation, classical conditioning, and other basic forms of learning, as shown in Figure 7.8. One subtype of implicit memory, procedural memory, refers to memory for motor skills and habits. Whenever we ride a bicycle or open a soda can, we're relying on procedural memory. In contrast to semantic memory, which is know-what memory, procedural memory is know-how memory. Our procedural and semantic memories for the same skills are sometimes surprisingly different. For those of you who are avid typists, find a keyboard and type the word the. That's a breeze, right? Now turn away from the keyboard for a moment and try to remember where the T, H, and E are located, but without moving your fingers. If you're like most people, you'll draw a blank. You may even find that the only way to remember their location is to use your fingers to type the imaginary letters in midair. Although your procedural memory for locating letters on a keyboard is effortless, your semantic memory for locating them is a different story. A second subtype of implicit memory, priming, refers to our ability to identify a stimulus more easily or more quickly when we've previously encountered similar stimuli. Imagine that a researcher flashes the word queen, interspersed with a few hundred other words, very quickly on a computer screen. An hour later, she asks you to perform a task that requires you to fill in the missing letters of a word. In this case, the STEM completion task is K. Research shows that having seen the word queen, you're more likely to complete the STEM with king, as opposed to kill or no, for example, than are participants who haven't seen queen. This is true, incidentally, even for participants who insist they can't even remember having seen the word queen. This memory is implicit because it doesn't require any deliberate effort on our part. If you're having a hard time keeping all of these subtypes of long-term memory straight, Figure 7.8 summarizes the major subtypes of explicit and implicit memory, including those we've discussed. 7.2. The three processes of memory. 7.2a. Identify methods for connecting new information to existing knowledge. 7.2b. Identify the role that schemas play in the storage of memories. 7.2c. Distinguish ways of measuring memory. 7.2d. Describe how the relation between encoding and retrieval conditions influences remembering. How do we transfer information into our long-term memories? Memory psychologists agree that there are three major processes of memory: encoding, storage, and retrieval. By the way, we shouldn't confuse these three processes with the three systems of memory we've just discussed: sensory, short-term, and long-term. Whereas the three systems refer to the what of memory, the three processes we're about to discuss refer to the how of memory. They explain how information passes into long-term memory and gets back out again when we need it. See Figure 7.9. To understand these three processes of memory, picture yourself working as a librarian at your college or university library. When a new book arrives, you first give it a number to identify it. That's encoding. Then you file it away on the bookshelf. That's storage. Then, when you want to find the book a few weeks, months, or even years later, you go to the shelves and fetch it. That's retrieval. Of course, like all metaphors, this one is an oversimplification, because the memories we retrieve are rarely identical to those we initially encoded. Some of the books in our mental library may become yellow with age. Others become marked up or even damaged beyond recognition. Encoding, the call numbers of the mind. Encoding refers to the process of getting information into our memory banks. To remember something, we first need to make sure the information is in a format our memories can use. To a far greater extent than we realize, many of our memory failures are actually failures of encoding. To go back to our library analogy, imagine that the librarian assigns an identification number to some of the books that come in for processing, but later decides to toss some of them in the trash instead. These books never make it to the shelves. Once we lose the chance to encode an event, we'll never remember it. No encoding, no memory. The role of attention. To encode something, we must first attend to it. Have you ever had the embarrassing experience of going to a party and being introduced to several people at the same time, and then realizing that you'd immediately forgotten all of their names? Odds are high that you were so nervous or distracted that you never encoded their names in the first place. That principle helps to explain why the popular belief that our brains preserve a record of every event we've ever encountered can't be right. Most events we've experienced are never encoded, and almost all events we do encode include only some of the details of the experience. Much of our everyday experience never gets into our brain in the first place. For instance, consider this example of an everyday object we've seen hundreds, even thousands of times. Take a look at Figure 7.10, where you'll see an array of 6 pennies. Which of these pennies is the real one? If you flunked this miniature test of common sense, don't feel too bad. When 2 researchers conducted a similar version of this test about 3 decades ago, they found that fewer than half of 203 Americans surveyed identified the correct penny. We see pennies almost every day, yet how often do we actually pay attention to the details of them? Encoding also helps to explain the familiar next-in-line effect. You've experienced this phenomenon if you've ever been in a class when the instructor called on several students in a row to answer a question or say their names. You probably found that your memory was especially poor for what the person immediately before you said. That's because you were so preoccupied with what you were going to say that you weren't paying much attention to what the person right before you was saying. Mnemonics, valuable memory aids. What do the following strange passages have in common? 1. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. 2. 30 days hath September, April, June, and November. All the rest have 31, except for February, which has 28, and you probably think it's great. Or maybe it's when fine, on leap year, it has 29. 3. Every good boy does fine. As the following video points out, each is a mnemonic, pronounced mnemonic. A learning aid, strategy, or device that enhances recall. Mnemonics help us encode memories in a way that makes them easier to recall. From time to time, virtually all of us use recall boosters, like making lists or writing appointments on a calendar, cell phone, or iPad. Nevertheless, mnemonics differ from these external memory aids in that they rely on internal mental strategies, namely, strategies we use during encoding that help us later retrieve useful information. Chunking, which we've already discussed, is also a type of mnemonic device, as the video points out. Item 1 specifies the proper order of mathematical operations: parenthesis, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction, by having each word start with the same letter as the mathematical operation. Item 2 is a rhyme that's a handy way of remembering the number of days in each month. Item 3 stands for the notes on the lines of the treble clef in musical notation: E, G, B, D, F. Mnemonic devices share two major features. First, we can apply them to just about anything and everything: the names of planets, the elements of the periodic table, the bones of the hand, the order of geological time periods, and the colors of the rainbow, the last being Roy, G, Biv, for red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. Second, most mnemonics depend on our having a store of knowledge to begin with. We need to know something about mathematical operations for the mnemonic about Aunt Sally to make any sense. So in general, mnemonics are most helpful as mental shortcuts for recalling lists of information we've already learned. There are many other mnemonic approaches in addition to those we've discussed. We'll review 3 here. Pegword method. By elementary school age, most of us were well acquainted with the exploits of Jack and Jill, Little Bo Peep, and Little Jack Horner. Songs ranging from Twinkle Twinkle Little Star to the hip-hop songs of the Black Eyed Peas are easy to remember because they contain rhymes. Rhyming is a key component of the pegword method, often used to recall ordered lists of words. To master this mnemonic, first associate each number in a list with a word that rhymes with the number, such as 1 is a bun. The word associated with the number is a pegword. It's essential to memorize a list like the one that follows, but the fact that the numbers and words rhyme makes it easy to do so. 1 is a bun. 2 is a shoe. 3 is a tree. And 4 is a door. Suppose you need to learn 4 words associated with memory concepts for your psychology class. Don't you wish there were only 4 new terms in this chapter? And that you need to recall them in the following order: chunking, elaboration, hippocampus, and decay. After you've memorized the pegword associated with each number, such as 1 is a bun, create an image that associates the word you want to remember with the pegword, such as bun. For the first word, chunking, you could imagine a bun, the pegword, with a chunk missing or broken up into chunks. For 2, elaboration, you might imagine a shoe with elaborate beading, sequins, and bows. For 3, hippocampus, imagine a tree with a hippo camping under it. For number 4, decay, you might picture a rotting, decaying door on an old house. When you need to remember the third item on your list, for example, you'd say to yourself that 3 is a tree, which would prompt recall of the hippo camping under it, and you'd know that the third word on the list is hippocampus. See Figure 7.11. Researchers have found that repeated use of the peg word method enhances students' delayed recall for ordered lists of unfamiliar terms, suggesting that the method may be a useful study strategy for improving vocabulary. Method of loci. The method of loci, pronounced loci, relies on imagery of places, that is, locations, hence the name of the mnemonic. The method is straightforward. Think of a path with which you're familiar and can imagine vividly. Perhaps it's the route from your dorm to the cafeteria, or a stroll through the rooms in your apartment. Think of the path you take and the things that you encounter in a set order. For example, to get to the cafeteria, first you get in the elevator. Then you walk under a huge tree before you pass by a fountain, and so on. If you need to remember 5 words in a particular order, think of 5 things you'll encounter on your way to the cafeteria. If you need to recall 10 words, imagine 10 locations along your route. If you were trying to remember the list of memory terms with the method of loci, you might imagine chunks of rock or glass on the floor of the elevator. Researchers have used the method of loci to help depressed individuals recall positive, self-affirming memories to lift their moods. Keyword method. If you've taken a foreign language course, you may be familiar with the keyword method. This strategy depends on your ability to think of an English word, the keyword, that reminds you of the word you're trying to remember. Take the Spanish word casa, which means house in English. Think of an English word, like case, that sounds like or brings to mind casa. Now think of an image that combines case, or another word of your choice, and house. Perhaps you can picture a guitar case on the roof of your house. When you think of this image and the accompanying word case, they should help you to retrieve the meaning of casa. People who learn foreign vocabulary benefit from the keyword strategy compared with more traditional methods, such as rote memorization. Likewise, researchers have found that the keyword strategy was effective for 3rd graders, including students with learning disabilities, in mastering new vocabulary words. Music. Can putting material to be learned to a familiar melody, like Pop Goes the Weasel or Yankee Doodle Dandy, assist in learning? That's what one pair of researchers set out to determine. They included lists of names in the 2 songs, and participants either listened to one or the other tune or heard the words in the lists spoken. The researchers found no initial recall advantage for people who learned the names with musical accompaniment. Nevertheless, those who heard the sung version required fewer trials to relearn the names a week later, suggesting that learning information put to a melody improves long-term retention. Generally speaking, mnemonics can be helpful if we're motivated to practice them on a regular basis. Mnemonics require training, patience, and occasionally even a dash of creativity. Psychomythology. Smart pills. The next time you're in your local drugstore, stop by the aisle containing herbal remedies. There you'll find a virtual museum of so-called smart pills designed to enhance memory. Ginkgo, vitamin E, and even drugs with unpronounceable but scientific-sounding names like phosphatidylserine, ceticosaline, and pyrazetam. Can any of them help us remember where we mislaid our keys this morning, memorize the names of the 10 people we met at last night's party, or recall how to spell phosphatidylserine? Probably the best-known herbal remedy for memory is ginkgo, whose scientific name is Ginkgo biloba, an ancient Chinese medicine extracted from the leaves of the ginkgo tree. Although it might be tempting to assume that ginkgo is effective because it's been used for many centuries, this would be an example of the argument from antiquity fallacy, CLO 1.2b, which is the error of concluding that something must be effective because it's been around for a long time. The manufacturers of ginkgo claim that it can markedly improve normal people's memory in as little as 4 weeks. Like many other memory boosters, ginkgo presumably works in part by increasing the level of the brain's acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter that plays a key role in memory, CLO 3.1C. Ginkgo is remarkably popular. Americans spend $249 million on it per year, yet controlled studies comparing ginkgo with a placebo show that its effects on memory in normal individuals are minimal, even non-existent. If ginkgo produces any effects on normal memory at all, they appear to be about equal to those of drinking a glass of lemonade or any sugary liquid. Sugar is the brain's fuel, CLO 3.4A. Ginkgo's effects on memory in people with Alzheimer's disease or other forms of dementia are slight, and perhaps even non-existent. There's no good evidence that it can reverse severe memory loss or stave off age-related cognitive decline. Moreover, like many herbal remedies, ginkgo can be harmful in certain cases. It can interfere with the effects of blood-thinning medicines, and thereby cause excessive bleeding. As for the other smart pills we mentioned with fancy names, the evidence for their effects on memory is too preliminary to draw strong conclusions. Finally, what about pills designed to boost attention and keep us awake, perhaps just long enough to study for that dreaded final exam? Not surprisingly, some of these drugs are becoming popular on college campuses. Surveys show that up to 30% of college students have used Ritalin, Adderall, and similar stimulants, widely prescribed for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, to help them concentrate while studying or taking exams. One team of investigators compared students taking the SAT, some of whom believed they were ingesting Ritalin and some of whom believed they were ingesting a dummy pill. The former students reported better mental functioning and attention, but their SAT scores weren't any higher. Yet both groups had actually received a dummy pill, suggesting that Ritalin's impact on test taking may be due to a placebo effect. Still other evidence suggests that stimulants may be helpful in consolidating declarative memories, like memories of facts, but the evidence is too preliminary to draw firm conclusions. Modafinil, its brand name is Provigil, commonly prescribed for narcolepsy, sleep apnea, and other sleep disorders, is also popular as an aid for maintaining wakefulness and alertness. Nevertheless, research suggests that although modafinil may be about as effective as caffeine for enhancing attention in sleep-deprived people, at least some of its effects on fatigue may not exceed those of a placebo. Because the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, no longer regulates diet supplements and herbal remedies, including those intended to enhance memory, it's anybody's guess whether they work, or even whether any might be harmful. As is so often the case in pop psychology, the best advice for those of us hoping to become memory whizzes overnight is caveat emptor. Let the buyer beware. Storage. Filing away our memories. Once we filed away a library book on the shelf, it sits there, often for years at a time, collecting dust and cobwebs. We've stored it, perhaps to be retrieved one day by a student or professor who needs it for a writing project. Storage refers to the process of keeping information in memory. Yet, where in the library we choose to file this book depends on our interpretation and expectations regarding the book's content. Let's imagine a new book titled The Psychology of Dating has just arrived in the library. Should we file this book in the psychology section, along with books on personality, emotion, and social psychology, or in the relationship section, along with books on dating, attraction, and marriage? The answer depends on what we think is most important or relevant about the book's content. Similarly, how we store our experiences in memory depends on our interpretations and expectations of these events. The value of schemas. Consider this scenario. You and your friends go to a brand new sit-down restaurant. Although this is your first visit, you've got a pretty good idea of what's in store. That's because you possess a schema for eating at a nice restaurant. A schema is an organized knowledge structure or mental model that we've stored in memory. Our schema for restaurants is characterized by a set order of events, sometimes called a script. You're seated at a table, given menus from which you order food, wait while your food is prepared, eat the food, get the check, and pay for the food before leaving. And don't forget the tip. There's even a standard sequence in ordering, at least in US culture. We order drinks first, followed by appetizers, soup or salad, entrees, and finally dessert and coffee. Schemas serve a valuable function. They equip us with frames of reference for interpreting new situations. Without schemas, we'd find some information almost impossible to comprehend. For example, if you've ever switched suddenly to a new smartphone, you know how confusing doing so can be at first. You may not have an understanding of how the keyboard is arranged, of what apps are in which places, or perhaps even how to change various settings. Schemas and memory mistakes. Valuable as they are, schemas can sometimes create problems because they can lead us to remember things that never happened. Schemas simplify, which is good because they help us make sense of the world. But schemas sometimes oversimplify, which is bad because they can produce memory illusions, as the chapter opening video demonstrates. Schemas provide one key explanation for the paradox of memory. They enhance memory in some cases, but lead to memory errors in others. For example, Mark Snyder and Seymour Uranowitz, 1978, presented participants with a case study of the life of a woman, Betty Kay. After reading this case study, some participants learned that Betty was now living a heterosexual lifestyle. Others learned that she was living a homosexual lifestyle. Snyder and Uranowitz then gave participants a recognition test for the details in the passage. They found that participants distorted their memories of the original information, such as her relationship with her father and past dating habits, to be in line with their schema. Their beliefs about her current lifestyle. For example, participants who believed Betty to be homosexual mistakenly recalled her as never having dated men in high school. If we're not careful, our schemas can lead us to overgeneralize, painting all members of a category with the same broad brush. Retrieval. Heading for the stacks. To remember something, we need to fetch it from our long-term memory banks. This is retrieval, the third and final process of memory. Yet, as we mentioned earlier, this is where our metaphor of a library begins to break down, because what we retrieve from our memory often doesn't match what we put into it. Our memories are reconstructive, often transforming our recollections to fit our beliefs and expectations. Many types of forgetting result from failures of retrieval. Our memories are still present, but we can't access them. It's pretty easy to demonstrate this point. If a friend is nearby, try the following demonstration, courtesy of psychologist Endel Tulving. Even if you don't have a friend handy, you can still follow along. Read each category in Table 7.1 to your friend, followed by the word that goes along with it. Tell your friend that after you're done reading all of the categories and their corresponding words, you'll ask him or her to recall just the words, in any order, not the categories. Table 7.1. Demonstration of retrieval cues. Read each category and corresponding word to a friend. Then ask your friend to recall only the words in any order. For each word your friend forgot, ask whether he or she remembers something from that word's category. As you'll see, this demonstration helps to make a simple point. Many memory failures are actually failures of retrieval. Category: a metal. Word, silver. A precious stone, pearl. A relative, niece. A bird, canary. Type of reading material, journal. A military title, major. A color, violet. A four-legged animal, mouse. A piece of furniture, dresser. A part of the body, finger. A fruit, cherry. A weapon, cannon. A type of dwelling, mansion. An alcoholic beverage, brandy. A crime, kidnapping. An occupation, plumber. A sport, lacrosse. An article of clothing, sweater. A musical instrument, saxophone. An insect, wasp. After you read the list to your friend, ask him or her to take a few minutes to write down as many words as he or she can remember. Almost certainly your friend missed some of them. For those missing words, prompt your friend with the category. So if your friend missed finger, ask, do you remember the word that went with a part of the body? You'll probably find that these prompts help your friend to remember some of the forgotten words. In psychological lingo, the category names serve as retrieval cues, hints that make it easier for us to recall information. So your friend's long-term memory contained these missing words, but he or she needed the retrieval cues to remember them. Measuring memory. Psychologists assess people's memory in three major ways: recall, recognition, and relearning. Think of them as the 3 R's. Another mnemonic device, by the way. Recall and recognition. What kind of exam do you find the toughest? Essay or multiple choice? For sure, we've all taken multiple choice tests that are killers. Still, all else being equal, essay tests are usually harder than multiple choice tests. That's because recall, that is, generating previously remembered information on our own, tends to be more difficult than recognition, selecting previously remembered information from an array of options. To demonstrate what we mean, try recalling the 6th President of the United States. Unless you're an American history buff, you may be stumped. If so, try this question instead. The 6th President of the United States was A. George Washington, B. John Quincy Adams, C. Bill Clinton, D. Carly Fiorina. With a bit of thought, you probably figured out that B was the correct answer. You could safely eliminate A, because you know George Washington was the first president, C, because you know Bill Clinton was a much more recent president, and D, because you know Carly Fiorina hasn't been president. Moreover, you may well have recognized John Quincy Adams as an early U.S. president, even if you didn't know he was number 6. Why is recall usually harder than recognition? In part, it's because recalling an item requires 2 steps: generating an answer and then determining whether it seems correct, whereas recognizing an item takes only 1 step: determining which item from a list seems most correct. Relearning. A third way of measuring memory is relearning. How much more quickly we learn information when we study something we've already studied relative to when we studied it the first time. For this reason, psychologists often call this approach the method of savings. Now that we've studied something, we don't need to take as much time to refresh our memories of it. That is, we've saved time by studying it. The concept of relearning originated with the pioneering work of German researcher Hermann Ebbinghaus, 1885, well over a century ago. Ebbinghaus used hundreds of nonsense syllables like ZAK and BOL to test his own recollection across differing time intervals. As we can see in Figure 7.12, he found that most of our forgetting occurs almost immediately after learning new material, with less and less forgetting after that. Nevertheless, he also found that when he attempted to relearn the nonsense syllables he had forgotten after a delay, he learned them much more quickly the second time around. Imagine you learn to play the guitar in high school, but haven't played it for several years. When you sit down to strum an old song, you're rusty at first. Although you need to go back to your notes to remind yourself the first couple of times you sit down to play, you'll probably find that it doesn't take you nearly as long to get the hang of the song the second time around. That's relearning. Relearning shows that a memory for this skill was still lurking in your brain, somewhere. Relearning is a more sensitive measure of memory than either recall or recognition. That's because relearning allows us to assess memory using a relative amount. How much faster was material learned the second time, rather than the simple right or wrong we obtain from recall or recognition. It also allows us to measure memory for procedures, like driving a car or playing a piano piece, as well as for facts and figures. When memorizing his nonsense syllables, Ebbinghaus happened on a crucial principle that applies to most forms of learning, the law of distributed versus massed practice. Simply put, this law tells us that we tend to remember things better in the long run when we spread our learning over long intervals than when we pack it into short intervals. This principle is probably one of the best replicated effects in all of psychology. Even infants and children with autism show it. Herein lies another word to the wise. Cramming for an exam helps us remember the information for that exam, but it typically produces poor long-term retention. If you want to master the information in your psychology course, or any course for that matter, you should spread out your review of the material over long intervals. So when one of your teachers nags you to start studying at least a week before the exam, rather than waiting until the last minute, you have Ebbinghaus to thank, or blame. Tip of the tongue phenomenon. We've all experienced retrieval failure in the form of the frustrating tip of the tongue, tot phenomenon, in which we're sure we know the answer to a question but can't come up with it, which, we might add, can be a real problem if you're participating in a trivia contest. It's surprisingly easy to generate this phenomenon. Read the names of the 10 U.S. states in Table 7.2 and try to name their capital cities. Now focus on the states for which you're unsure of whether you know the right answer and keep trying. If you're still stuck, look at the hints in the table caption, which give you the first letter of the capital of each state. Did the first letters help? Research shows when we experience the tot phenomenon, they often will. The fact that we sometimes experience tot tells us that there's a difference between something we've forgotten, because it didn't get stored in memory, and something that's in there somewhere that we can't quite retrieve. Two investigators showed that when people believe that something is on the tip of their tongues, they're frequently right. They presented participants with the definitions of relatively rare words, such as to give up the throne, and asked them to come up with the word, in this case, abdicate. About 10% of the time, participants reported a tot experience. They were pretty sure they knew the word, but couldn't generate it. In these cases, the researchers asked the participants to guess the first letter of the word or the number of syllables in it. Interestingly, the participants did much better than chance. So participants did know something about the word, they just couldn't spit it out whole. Encoding specificity, finding things where we left them. Why is it easier to retrieve some things from memory than others? One answer to this mystery lies in the principle of encoding specificity, introduced by Endel Tulving. We're more likely to remember something when the conditions present at the time we encoded it are also present at retrieval. We can see this principle at work in several psychological phenomena, two of which we'll examine here: context-dependent learning and state-dependent learning. Context-dependent learning. Context-dependent learning refers to superior retrieval when the external context of the original memories matches the retrieval context. Duncan Godden and Alan Baddeley, 1975, provided an example of this effect in an ingenious study of scuba divers. They presented divers with 40 unrelated words, while the divers were either standing on the beach or submerged in about 15 feet of water. Godden and Baddeley then tested the divers in either the same or a different context from which they presented the words. The diver's memory was best when the original context matched the retrieval context, regardless of whether they were on land or underwater, as shown in Figure 7.13. There's even evidence for context-dependent learning when undergraduates take exams. Students tend to do slightly better on their exams when tested in the same classroom in which they learned the material. You may want to gently remind your introductory psychology instructor of this fact when he or she schedules the room for your next test. Still, this effect isn't all that powerful, and not all researchers have replicated it. That's probably because you've acquired the information not only in the classroom, but also in other settings, such as the room in which you're now reading this text. State-dependent learning. Despite its name, state-dependent learning doesn't mean that if you learned something while on vacation in the state of Montana, you need to go back to Montana to recall it. Instead, state-dependent learning is similar to context-dependent learning, except that it refers to the internal state of the organism rather than the external context. That is, state-dependent learning refers to superior retrieval of memories when the organism is in the same physiological or psychological state as it was during encoding. There's anecdotal evidence for this phenomenon among people with alcoholism, who often report that they need to get drunk to locate items, including their favorite bottles of liquor, that they'd hidden while drinking. Of course, we've learned that anecdotes are limited as sources of scientific evidence. See LO 1.2a. Nevertheless, in this case, controlled studies bear out the anecdotes. People who've learned a task while under the influence of alcohol tend to remember it better when under the influence than when sober. Still, researchers haven't always replicated these findings, suggesting that state-dependent effects probably depend in complex ways on the participants tested and stimuli administered. State-dependent learning sometimes extends to mood, in which case it's termed mood-dependent learning. Studies show that both younger and older adults find it easier to recall and recognize unpleasant memories than pleasant ones when they're sad, and easier to recall and recognize pleasant memories than unpleasant ones when they're happy. Mood-dependent learning can create nasty difficulties for researchers who want to draw conclusions about people's life histories. Specifically, it can result in a retrospective bias. Our current psychological state can distort memories of our past. For example, most individuals with clinical depression report having been treated more harshly by their parents in childhood than do individuals without clinical depression. One explanation for this finding is that harsh parental treatment predisposes to later depression. But there's another explanation. Perhaps people's bad moods distort their memories of their childhoods. To evaluate this possibility, researchers asked 3 groups of participants. 1. People who had clinical depression. 2. People who had a history of clinical depression but weren't currently depressed. And 3. People who'd never been depressed, about how their parents treated them as children. Currently depressed participants record their parents as having been more rejecting and domineering toward them as children than did participants in the other two groups. So participants' moods seem to have influenced their evaluations of how their parents had treated them. In this case, we don't know whether the participants with clinical depression were less accurate than the participants in the other groups, only that their memories were different. Mildly, but not severely, depressed people may sometimes be more accurate in their memories than non-depressed people. See LO 15.3b. To overcome the challenges posed by retrospective biases arising from mood-related disorders, researchers are increasingly turning to methods that monitor participants' recollections in real time, such as by beeping them during the day at random intervals. 7.3. The Biology of Memory. 7.3a. Describe the role of long-term potentiation in memory. 7.3b. Distinguish different types of amnesia and the relevance of amnesia to the brain's organization of memory. 7.3c. Identify the key impairments of Alzheimer's disease. Although few of us think about it, the biology of memory plays a pivotal role in our daily lives, whether it's remembering where we left our keys or the name of that friendly person we met at last night's party. What's more, understanding how our brains store memory may help us find ways of treating devastating diseases that impair our ability to recall everyday events. The neural basis of memory storage. Locating where a library book is stored is generally pretty easy. We look it up in our library's online system, write down its number, go to the shelf, and, unless someone's recently plucked it away, find it. If we're lucky, it's right there on the shelf where it's supposed to be. Yet, as we'll soon see, memory storage in the brain isn't quite this cut and dry. The elusive engram. Beginning in the 1920s, psychologist Carl Lashley went in search of the engram, the physical trace of each memory in the brain. He taught rats how to run mazes and lesioned different parts of their brains to see if they forgot how to find their way. By doing so, Lashley hoped to discover where memory is stored in the brain. Yet after years of painstaking work, he came up empty-handed. Still, Lashley learned two important things. First, the more brain he removed, the worse the rats performed on the maze. There's no great surprise there. Second, no matter where he removed brain tissue, the rats retained at least some memory of the maze. Even removing up to half of rats' cortices didn't erase the memory. These findings led Lashley to conclude that we can't simply point to a spot in the brain and say, "There's the memory of my first kiss," because that memory isn't located in a single place, like a library book sitting on a shelf. Instead, as scientists have since learned, memories of different features of experiences, like their sound, sight, and smell, are almost certainly stored in different brain regions. Over a half-century ago, Donald Hebb, 1949, suggested that the engram is instead located in assemblies, organized groups of neurons in the brain. According to Hebb, one neuron, A, becomes connected to another neuron, B, when it repeatedly activates that neuron. Neurons, fed by a rich blend of neurotransmitters, form circuits, integrate sensory information in meaningful ways, and transform our experience of the world into lasting, perhaps even lifelong memories. Long-term potentiation. A physiological basis for memory. Long-term potentiation, LTP, refers to a gradual strengthening of the connections among neurons by repetitive stimulation over time. Turge Lomo first observed LTP in the hippocampus of rabbits in 1966. a finding replicated by many later researchers in other animals and humans. The gist of what neuroscientists have learned since the discovery of LTP is that neurons that fire together wire together. To a large extent, Hebb was right. Today, many researchers believe that our ability to store memories depends on strengthening the connections among neurons arranged in sprawling networks that extend to the far and deep recesses of our brains. See video Neuroscience of Memory. The question of whether LTP is directly responsible for the storage of memories, or whether it affects learning indirectly by increasing arousal and attention, remains unresolved. Still, most scientists agree that LTP plays a key role in learning, and that the hippocampus plays a critical role in forming lasting memories. LTP and glutamate. LTP tends to occur at synapses, where the sending neuron releases the neurotransmitter glutamate into the synaptic cleft, the space between the sending and receiving neuron, CLO 3.1a. As shown in Figure 7.14, glutamate interacts with receptors for NMDA and another substance, AMPA. LTP enhances the release of glutamate into the synaptic cleft, resulting in enhanced learning. A research team was even able to create a super smart mouse by manipulating its genes to create extra receptors for NMDA. Compared with everyday mice, the super smart mouse is an especially quick and effective learner. Where is memory stored? Clearly, the hippocampus is critical to memory. Some researchers have even identified neurons in the hippocampus that fire in response only to certain celebrities, such as actress Halle Berry, CLO 4.6b. One source of evidence for the role of the hippocampus in memory comes from research on Clark's nutcracker, a remarkable North American bird. To help it prepare for long winters, Clark's nutcracker buries up to 33,000 seeds in about 5,000 places, spread over about 150 square miles, and manages to locate most of them months later, even though they're often buried under several feet of snow. Clark's nutcracker has an unusually large hippocampus, which may help to explain its exceptional spatial memory. But is the hippocampus, or any single brain structure, the site of the elusive engram? We can say with some certainty that the answer is no. Functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, studies reveal that learned information isn't stored permanently in the hippocampus itself. Rather, the prefrontal cortex seems to be one of the major banks from which we withdraw our memories. But as Lashley discovered, damage to isolated areas of the prefrontal cortex, or other cortical regions for that matter, doesn't wipe out long-established memories. Much as the smell of a rose diffuses throughout a room, our memories distribute themselves throughout many areas of the cortex. Amnesia, biological basis of explicit and implicit memory. Earlier, we learned about explicit and implicit memory. Research demonstrates that two forms of memory are governed largely by different brain systems. Although memory systems across the brain interact to shape our experiences and memories, whether they are implicit or explicit. The best evidence regarding the biological roots of implicit and explicit memories comes from individuals with severe amnesia. The two most common types of amnesia are retrograde amnesia, in which we lose some memories of our past, and anterograde amnesia, in which we lose the capacity to form new memories. Amnesia, fictions, and facts. Contrary to popular belief, generalized amnesia, in which people have lost all details of their previous life, is quite rare. Even retrograde amnesia isn't especially common. Anterograde amnesia is much more frequent among people with brain damage. Also, although many Hollywood films depict memory recovery from amnesia as abrupt, recovery from amnesia tends to occur gradually, if at all. Case studies of amnesia. H. M. and Clive Waring. By far the best-known person with amnesia in the psychological literature was a man from Connecticut, known only by the initials H. M. He suffered from severe epileptic seizures that his doctors couldn't control with medication. In March 1953, in a last-ditch attempt to eliminate these seizures, surgeons removed large chunks of H.M.'s temporal lobes, including both his left and right hippocampi, where they had reason to believe the seizures originated. The surgeons of the time didn't anticipate the disastrous impact of this radical operation, which would probably never be performed today. At the time, H.M. was 26 years old. Following the operation, H.M. developed virtually complete anterograde amnesia. He could recall almost no new information, although he also experienced some retrograde amnesia for the 11 years prior to the surgery. His memories from the first 15 years of his life remained pretty much intact. In the decades following his surgery, H.M.'s life was, for all intents and purposes, frozen in time. H.M. himself put it eloquently, "Every day is alone by itself. Whatever enjoyment I have had, whatever sorrow I have had." Among other things, he was oblivious to the fact that he had undergone surgery. 2 years after the operation, in 1955, he reported the current date as March 1953. H.M. read the same magazines and completed the same jigsaw puzzles over and over again, without any awareness of having seen them before. He didn't recall having met physicians whom he met just a few minutes earlier, or remembered what he ate for lunch 30 minutes ago. Even when informed repeatedly of the death of his uncle, he showed the same dramatic grief to the news each time. H.M.'s identity was revealed as Henry Molaison only after his death in December 2008, at the age of 82. For 55 years he acquired virtually no new explicit memories. Still, at least one author has recently argued that H.M. may have experienced damage to his frontal lobes during surgery, raising the possibility that his hippocampal damage may not fully explain his severe memory impairment. H.M.'s tragic case, like that of Damasio's patient David, illustrates a striking dissociation between explicit and implicit memory. Researchers asked H.M. to trace simple geometrical shapes from a mirror, see Figure 7.15, a task that just about all people find infuriatingly difficult when they first try it. Although H.M. had no recollection of ever having performed this task before, his performance improved steadily over time. So, although H.M. had no explicit memory for this task, he displayed clear-cut implicit, specifically procedural memory for it. When researchers examined H.M.'s brain using imaging techniques, they found that not only his hippocampus, but also his surrounding cortex and neighboring amygdala, see LO 3.2a, were damaged. This finding and others led researchers to hypothesize that large circuits connecting different parts of the limbic system, including the hippocampus and amygdala, are critical to memory. See Figure 7.16. Similar evidence for a distinction between explicit and implicit memory comes from the case of Clive Waring, a former music producer in Great Britain whose hippocampi, along with several other brain structures, were destroyed by a herpes virus in 1985. Like H.M., Clive has virtually complete anterograde amnesia. When his wife leaves the room for a few minutes and returns, he showers her with immense affection, as though he hasn't seen her in years. Yet Clive shows implicit memory in the form of priming effects. When his wife says St. Mary's, he quickly responds Paddington, entirely oblivious of why he says that. The name of the hospital to which Clive Waring was taken after his viral infection was, you guessed it, St. Mary's, Paddington. The bottom line: damage to the hippocampus impairs explicit memory, but leaves implicit memory intact. Emotional memory. We usually think of memory as our good friend, as a lifelong companion that helps us to store useful information, allowing us to cope with our environment. Yet our memories can also bring us distress, as in the case of a 53-year-old woman who reported olfactory, smell, memories tracking back to a brutal gang rape decades earlier. Olfactory hallucinations of leather, alcohol, and the aftershave Old Spice, all of which were present at the rape scene, triggered intense fear responses that led her to retreat to a closet and engage in self-destructive behavior. The role of the amygdala. The amygdala is where the emotional components of these and other memories, especially those governing fear, are stored. The amygdala interacts with the hippocampus during the formation of memory, but each structure contributes different information. Refer again to Figure 7.16. Researchers uncovered the specific roles of the amygdala and hippocampus in a study of 2 patients identified by their initials, SM and WS. The first suffered damage to the amygdala, the second to the hippocampus. The patient with amygdala damage, SM, who is featured in the chapter opening video for Chapter 11, remembered facts about the fear-producing experience but did not experience the fear itself. In contrast, the patient with hippocampal damage, WS, experienced the fear but not the facts surrounding the fear-producing experience. So the amygdala and hippocampus play distinctive roles in memory, with the amygdala helping us recall the emotions associated with fear-provoking events, and the hippocampus helping us recall the events themselves. Erasing painful memories. What if it were possible to erase or take the sting out of traumatic or painful memories, like witnessing someone's death or experiencing the devastating breakup of a relationship? As we've learned, emotional memories can persist, even if they often become distorted over time. The hormones adrenaline and norepinephrine, CLO 3.3A, are released in the face of stress and stimulate protein, beta-adrenergic, receptors on nerve cells, which solidify emotional memories. Lawrence Cahill and James McGaw, 1995, demonstrated the staying power of emotional memories in an elegant study. They created 2 stories regarding 12 slides they showed to participants. They told half of the participants an emotionally neutral story about a boy's visit to a hospital where his father works. They told the other half a far more disturbing story about the same slides. In the middle of the story, they informed participants that the boy was injured and operated on at a hospital to reattach his severed legs. Participants returned for a memory test 24 hours later, and Cahill and McGaw asked them what they remembered. Participants who heard the emotionally arousing story displayed the best recall for the part of the story about the boy's trauma. In contrast, participants who heard the neutral story recalled the same amount of detail for all parts of the story. Cahill and his colleagues conducted a similar experiment with an interesting twist. This time, they gave some participants a drug called propranolol, which blocks the effects of adrenaline on beta-adrenergic receptors. Doctors also use it to treat high blood pressure. When participants' adrenaline was inhibited by propranolol, they didn't display especially good recall for the emotionally arousing part of the story. In fact, their recall was no different from that of individuals who listened to the emotionally neutral story. Psychiatrist Roger Pittman reasoned that propranolol might blunt the memories of real-life traumas, such as automobile accidents. Pittman and his colleagues administered propranolol to people for 10 days after they experienced a traumatic event, such as a car accident, and, a month later, examined their physical reactions to individually prepared tapes that replayed key aspects of the event. 43% of participants who received a placebo showed a physical response to the tape that recreated their traumatic experience. Yet none of the people who received the drug did. Researchers have suggested that propranolol be used in combination with psychotherapy soon after a traumatic event to prevent the development of long-lasting stress reactions, such as those in post-traumatic stress disorder. Pittman's pill only dampened the effects of traumatic memories. It didn't erase them. Other investigators have replicated these findings using different designs. Still, this research hasn't laid to rest difficult questions about whether such procedures are ethical, much less desirable. After all, if we could choose to forget every negative experience, would we learn and grow from our mistakes? The mere fact that we can do something doesn't mean we should, so the debate continues. The biology of memory deterioration. As we humans pass the ripe old age of 65, we often begin to experience memory problems and some degeneration in the brain. Yet despite what many people believe, senility isn't an unavoidable part of aging, and some manage to make it past 100 with only modest amounts of everyday forgetfulness. But scientists disagree as to how much memory loss is normal during the advanced years. Some argue that we needn't accept any memory impairment as normal. Nevertheless, a longitudinal study of participants aged 59 to 84 years at baseline showed small but consistent reductions in the overall area of the cortex at 2- and 4-year intervals. We might assume that subtle cognitive decline would accompany these tissue losses, but alternative hypotheses are possible. For example, cognition may be fully preserved until a critical amount of tissue loss occurs. Many people equate senility with one cause, Alzheimer's disease. Yet Alzheimer's disease is only the most frequent cause of senility, accounting for about 50 to 60% of cases of dementia, that is, severe memory loss. Two other common causes of senility are the accumulation of multiple small strokes in the brain and deterioration in the frontal and temporal lobes. Alzheimer's disease occurs at alarming rates as people age. By 2050, 1 American will develop Alzheimer's disease every 33 seconds. The risk for Alzheimer's disease is 11% for those older than 65 years of age, but a whopping 42% for those older than 85 years of age. With the graying, aging of the U.S. population, Alzheimer's disease is expected to become even more of a concern in coming decades, with 14 to 16 million Americans projected to develop the disease by mid-century if a cure can't be found. The cognitive impairments of Alzheimer's disease are both memory and language-related, which corresponds to the patterns of cortical loss in this illness. See Figure 7.17. The memory loss begins with recent events, with memories of the distant past being the last to go. Patients with Alzheimer's forget their grandchildren's names well before forgetting their children's names. They also experience disorientation and are frequently at a loss as to where they are, what year it is, or who the current president is. The Alzheimer's brain contains many senile plaques and neurofibrillary tangles, CLO 3.1D. These abnormalities contribute to the loss of synapses and death of cells in the hippocampus and cerebral cortex. they may also contribute to memory loss and intellectual decline. Loss of synapses is correlated with intellectual status, with greater loss as the disease progresses. But this result doesn't necessarily mean that the reduction in synapses causes the memory decline. Along with the loss of synapses comes degeneration and death of acetylcholine neurons in the forebrain. Accordingly, the most common treatments for Alzheimer's disease today are drugs like donepezil, whose genetic name is Aricept, that boost the amount of acetylcholine in the brain by inhibiting its breakdown. There are also experimental procedures, such as gene therapies, that enhance the production of neurotrophic growth factors, which enable acetylcholine neurons to survive and thrive. Still, other promising medications block the actions of the neurotransmitter glutamate, which tends to be toxic to neurons in high doses, CLO 3.1C. Yet no treatment to date halts or reverses the course of Alzheimer's disease. At best, these treatments only slow its progression slightly. For this reason, researchers have evaluated people's lifestyles to see if anything can be done to reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease. A large study assessing more than 2,600 people, ages 60 to 77 years, showed that people at risk for dementia who participated in a 2-year intervention to improve diet, increase exercise, monitor vascular risk, and provide cognitive training, maintained or improved their cognitive functioning compared with people who didn't receive the intervention. This study followed promising research that found that physical activity and strong social networks were associated with reduced risk of cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease. One preliminary study with 10 people reported that it might be possible to reverse symptoms of Alzheimer's or less severe symptoms of memory loss with a personally tailored program involving comprehensive changes in diet, exercise, brain stimulation, sleep optimization, medications, and vitamins. Nevertheless, replication and extension of these promising findings will be necessary before we can be confident that they reflect dependable, long-lasting changes. Numerous correlational studies suggest that people who are highly educated and intellectually active are at decreased risk of Alzheimer's disease. Admittedly, these findings are ambiguous in their causal direction. Perhaps people who are more mentally and physically fit have more brain capacity to begin with. Yet these findings raise the possibility that the old maxim, use it or lose it, may contain a grain of truth. 7.4. The development of memory. Acquiring a personal history. 7.4a. Identify how children's memory abilities change with age. How early can children remember, and what do they remember? The answer depends on what kind of memory we're discussing. In one sense, we can remember information even before we're born. That's because fetuses display habituation, a decrease in attention to familiar stimuli. Fetuses as young as 32 weeks exhibit a decline in their reactions to vibratory stimulators over time. Habituation is a form of implicit memory. To interpret a stimulus as familiar, we need to recall we've experienced it before. It's a far cry from explicitly recalling the words to a song or remembering what we wore to our last birthday party, but it's still a form of remembering. Memory over time. Memory changes as we age, but there's considerable continuity over the course of development. On average, infants have worse memories than do children, who have worse memories than adults, and young adults have better memories than older adults. But the same basic processes operate across the lifespan. For example, infants display a serial position curve just as adults do. Nevertheless, the span of memory and the ability to use strategies increase dramatically across the infant, toddler, preschool, and elementary school years. Over time, children's memories become increasingly sophisticated. Several factors explain why. First, children's memory spans increase with age. In fact, their magic number doesn't become 7 plus or minus 2 until age 12 or so. If we ask a 3-year-old to remember a string of letters or numbers, she'll remember only about 3 on average. A 5-year-old will remember about 4. By age 9, children are getting close to the adult's magic number, remembering 6 items on average. Is this increase in span a result of better use of strategies, like rehearsal? That's certainly part of the story, but there's a large physical maturational component too. So in an odd turn of events, shoe size is actually more highly correlated with memory span in children than with either age or intelligence. Nevertheless, we can assure you that this correlation isn't a causal one. Because different children grow at different rates, this correlation reflects a biological maturity component to memory span, for which variables like shoe size and height are the best predictors. Second, our conceptual understanding increases with age. This fact is important because our ability to chunk related items and store memories in meaningful ways depends on our knowledge of the world. For example, without knowing that CIA stands for Central Intelligence Agency, children can't chunk the letters C, I, and A into one unit. Third, over time, children develop enhanced meta-memory skills, knowledge about their memory abilities and limitations. These skills help children to identify when they need to use strategies to improve their memories, as well as which strategies work best. If we show a 4-year-old 10 pictures and ask her how many she thinks she can remember, she'll probably tell you with supreme confidence that she can remember all 10. She can't. Children at this age don't appreciate their own memory limitations and overestimate their capacities as a result. Older children, who actually remember more than younger children do, estimate they'll remember less. As a result, they're more accurate in their ability to gauge their recall. Infants' implicit memory. Talking with their feet. Carolyn Rovey Collier developed an innovative technique to study infants' implicit memory. Her research capitalizes on the fact that we can operantly condition, see LO 6.2a, infants to perform specific behaviors. Rovey Collier placed infants in a crib with a mobile positioned over their heads. She first watched their behaviors for a few minutes to assess their activity levels in a baseline condition. Then she took a ribbon tied to the mobile and attached it to the infant's ankle. The next time the infant kicked her foot, she was in for a pleasant surprise. The mobile shook and jiggled in response. Infants find the motion of the mobile inherently reinforcing. Because the movement is dependent on infants' behavior, they quickly become conditioned to kick their legs to get the mobile moving. Once she conditioned infants to kick their legs in response to the mobile, Rovey Collier sent them home. Then, after a delay of a day, a week, or even a month, she brought them back to the lab and placed them in the crib again. This time, the mobile wasn't attached to the infant's leg, so there was no reinforcement. The question was, would infants show an increased kicking rate in response to seeing the mobile? If so, it would imply that they remembered the conditioning experience. Rovey Collier, 1993, found that children as young as 2 months retained a memory of this experience, although they forgot it after just a few days. Nevertheless, their span of recall increased quickly. 3-month-olds could remember the conditioning for more than a week, and 6-month-olds for more than 2 weeks. Infants' memories of the experience were surprisingly specific. If researchers modified even a few elements of the mobile or changed the pattern of the crib liner ever so slightly, infants didn't seem to recognize the mobile. Their kicking rate returned to baseline. Mysteries of psychological science. Why can't we remember the first few years of our lives? Take a brief break from reading this chapter and try to recall your earliest memory. What was it, and how old were you? Most students say their earliest memory falls somewhere between 3 and 5 years of age. Infantile amnesia is the inability of adults to retrieve accurate memories before an early age. Few, if any of us, correctly recall events before 2 or 3 years of age, the lowest cutoff for infantile amnesia, although there are differences among people in the boundary of this amnesia. Memories before that age just aren't trustworthy, so if you have a distinct memory of something that happened at age 1 or before, it's almost certainly either a false memory or a true memory of something that happened several years later. Recent research suggests that culture may shape the age and content of our first memories. Members of the Maori of New Zealand report the earliest memories recorded to date, with an average of a bit more than 2.5 years. Their mothers make more references in their interactions with their children to relative time and to internal emotional states, compared with New Zealand mothers of European descent. Learning about the sequential nature of autobiographical memory may assist Maori children in organizing their memories time-wise and in enhancing their recall of early events when they're older. Other research reveals that European Americans report earlier first memories than do people from Taiwan. Moreover, European Americans' earliest memories more often focus on themselves, whereas Taiwanese's earliest memories more often focus on others. These findings dovetail with research we'll describe later in the text, showing that European American cultures tend to be individually oriented, whereas many Asian cultures tend to be other-oriented. Unfortunately, proponents of some fringe psychological treatments have largely ignored the scientific evidence concerning infantile amnesia. Many advocates of hypnotic age regression claim to be able to retrieve memories from well before age 2, sometimes even before birth. At least one therapist even tried to recover his female client's memory of being trapped as an egg in her mother's fallopian tube prior to fertilization. Similarly, proponents of the Church of Scientology, popular among many Hollywood celebrities, believe that long-buried memories of negative statements overheard by fetuses, embryos, and even zygotes can be reactivated in adulthood, especially under stress. These memories, Scientologists claim, can trigger low self-esteem and other psychological problems. For example, if a fetus overhears her mother say, "I hate you," during a bitter argument with her husband, the grown adult may later misinterpret this statement as referring to her rather than to her father. Fortunately, for both fetuses and adults, there's no evidence for this extraordinary claim. Fetuses can't accurately make out most sentences they hear from outside the womb, let alone remember them decades later. No one knows for sure why the first few years of our lives are lost to us forever, but psychological science offers several promising leads. The hippocampus, which, as we learned, plays a key role in long-term memory, especially episodic memory, is only partially developed in infancy. So before age 2 or so, we may not possess the brain architecture needed to retain memories of events. Also, as infants, we possess little or no concept of self. Before about 18 months of age, infants can't recognize themselves in mirrors. Without a well-developed schema of self, Infants may not be able to encode or store memories of their experiences in a meaningful fashion, so these experiences will never be remembered. Seven 7.5 False Memories. When good memory goes bad. 7.5a Identify factors that influence people's susceptibility to false memories and memory errors. 7.5b Describe some of the real-world implications of false memories and memory errors. We generally trust our memories to provide us with an accurate recounting of our past. In many cases, our memories do the job well enough. Over the past few decades, however, researchers have shown that our memories can be more fallible than any of us could have imagined, as the chapter opening video also reminds us. Moreover, we're often far more confident of our recollections of events than we should be. False memories. In 1997, Nadine Kuhl, a 44-year-old nurse's aide in Wisconsin, won a $2.4 million malpractice settlement against her psychotherapist. Nadine entered treatment with relatively mild emotional problems, such as depressed mood and binge eating. Yet after 5 years of treatment, Nadine supposedly recovered childhood memories of having been a member of a murderous, satanic cult, of being raped, and of witnessing the murder of her 8-year-old childhood friend. Her therapist also persuaded her that she harbored more than 130 personalities, including demons, angels, children, and a duck. Her therapist apparently even listed her treatment as group therapy, on the grounds that he needed to treat numerous different personalities. All of these memories surfaced after Nadine participated in repeated sessions involving guided imagery, in which therapists ask clients to imagine past events, and hypnotic age regression, in which therapists use hypnosis to return clients to the psychological state of childhood. CLO 5.3b. The therapist also subjected Nadine to an exorcism and 15-hour marathon therapy sessions. As therapy progressed, she became overwhelmed by images of terrifying memories she was convinced were genuine. Eventually, however, Nadine came to doubt the reality of these memories, and she terminated treatment. Kuhl's story conveys a powerful message. What we take to be memories can be entirely false, although few of us, thankfully, will be subjected to the memory-shaping techniques and pressures that Nadine Kuhl endured. When important memories change, in extreme cases like Nadine Kuhl's, so do our identities. Following psychotherapy, Nadine came to believe she was a victim of brutal and repeated child abuse. She even came to believe she suffered from a severe condition, namely dissociative identity disorder, or DID, known formally as multiple personality disorder, which is supposedly characterized by the existence of alter personalities, or alters. It may seem strange that our memories can be so subject to change. How can this be? At first blush, our everyday experience strongly suggests that we can safely rely on our memories, because many of our recollections seem to be as crisp as scenes from a movie. Do you remember where you were and what you were doing when you heard about the untimely recent deaths of actor, comedian Robin Williams or musician Prince? Many Americans say yes, and some say that they can vividly recall the circumstances surrounding their learning of these surprising, even stunning deaths. Many older Americans report equally powerful memories of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963, or the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. Seemingly accurate recollections of the attempted assassination of President Ronald Reagan, the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger, and the deaths of Princess Diana and singer Michael Jackson are other examples. Flashbulb memories. It's no wonder that Roger Brown and James Cullick, 1977, referred to these and similar remembrances as flashbulb memories, emotional memories that seem so vivid that people appear to recount them in remarkable, even photographic detail. They further argued that flashbulb memories don't decay over time like ordinary memories. So flashbulb memories suggest that our memories sometimes operate like video cameras or DVDs after all, right? Maybe not. Ulrich Neiser and Nicole Harsh, 1992, decided to find out whether extremely vivid memories were accurate by studying college students' recollection of the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger in 1986. For many people, this was a particularly tragic and memorable event, because for the first time, a non-astronaut, a schoolteacher named Krista McAuliffe, was on board. Neiser and Harsh discovered that 2.5 to 3 years after the Challenger explosion, 75% of college students' reports of the event didn't match their recollections from only a few days following this event. Moreover, about a third of the students' stories changed dramatically over time. Consider this recollection from one of the participants almost immediately after the Challenger explosion. Initial recollection, January 1986. I was in my religion class, and some people walked in and started talking about the explosion. I didn't know any details except that it had exploded, and the school teacher's students had all been watching, which I thought was so sad. Then after class I went to my room and watched the TV program talking about it, and I got all the details from that. Here's the recollection from the same student more than 2.5 years later. Later recollection, September 1988. When I first heard about the explosion, I was sitting in my freshman dorm room with my roommate and we were watching TV. It came on a news flash and we were both totally shocked. I was really upset and went upstairs to talk to a friend of mine, and then I called my parents. When Neiser and Harsh presented students with their written recollections from several years earlier, some insisted that someone else must have written them. The authors coined the term phantom flashbulb memory to capture the idea that many seeming flashbulb memories are false. Researchers have replicated this phenomenon with a group of students asked to recall their memory of the 1995 verdict of the O.J. Simpson murder trial. After 32 months, 40% of the memory reports contained major distortions, relative to their initial recollection only 3 days after the verdict. Still, flashbulb memories typically contain substantial kernels of accuracy. For example, people who learned about the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, were usually correct in their recall about where they were when they heard about the attacks, but often wrong about what they were doing at the time or who told them. Deckel and Bonanno, 2013, recorded recollections of survivors of the terrorist attacks of 9/11 at 7 and 18 months after the event. People differed in their recall over time. Individuals resilient in the face of trauma or who recovered from their trauma-related symptoms created a more benign memory of the event as time passed, compared with people who continued to experience distress. This research indicates that so-called flashbulb and other strong emotional memories change over time, just like all other memories. Moreover, the rate of forgetting flashbulb memories is similar to that of ordinary memories. Flashbulb memories remind us that much as our memories may seem to work like video games, they don't. We don't need to invoke an entirely new set of explanations to explain vivid recollections. The most parsimonious hypothesis is that flashbulb memories aren't a separate class of memories. They're much like other memories, just more intense. Source monitoring. Who said that? Think back to a conversation you had yesterday with a friend. How do you know it really happened? About 25% of undergraduates report experiencing a distinct memory of an event, but feeling unsure of whether it actually occurred or was part of a dream. This is an example of a source monitoring confusion, a lack of clarity about the origin of a memory. According to a source monitoring view of memory, we try to identify the origins of our memories by seeking cues about how we encoded them. Source monitoring refers to our efforts to identify the origins, sources of a memory. We rely on source monitoring to recall which information source provided the information. Did you hear it on the news or from a friend? Have you ever started to tell someone a joke or story only to realize that he or she was the one who told it to you in the first place? Whenever we try to figure out whether a memory really reflects something that happened or whether we merely imagined it, we're engaging in source monitoring. For example, we typically rely on cues regarding how vivid and detailed our memories are. All things being equal, memories of our recent past that are more vivid and detailed are more likely to reflect actual events. Although, as we've learned, even these memories are sometimes inaccurate. If our memory of a conversation with a friend on campus is vague and fuzzy, we may begin to wonder whether it really happened, or was merely a product of our overactive imagination. In many cases, source monitoring works well by helping us avoid confusing our memories with our fantasies. This ability comes in handy when we're trying to recall whether we actually punched our obnoxious boss in the nose or just fantasized about doing so. Yet because cues regarding the vividness and detail of memories are far from perfect, source monitoring isn't perfect either. We can sometimes be fooled, and as we've learned, false memories can result. Source monitoring failure can account for why some people mistakenly recall that they engaged in an action even though they didn't perform it, but instead observed someone else doing it. Consider another example of source monitoring failure. Foster and Gary, 2012, asked participants to build Lego vehicles, such as a police car or train, and to complete some but not all steps in constructing the vehicles. While participants kept their eyes closed, the experimenter completed the steps the participants hadn't completed. When tested the following day, participants confidently remembered having completed steps they hadn't actually completed. Participants mentally filled in the actions related to the missing steps and later confused what they believed had occurred with their real actions. A source monitoring perspective helps us understand why some people are especially receptive to false memories. Remember the memory illusion test with all of the sleepy words at the beginning of the chapter? No, it's not a false memory. Some studies suggest that people who are fantasy-prone are more likely to experience memory illusions on this task. So are the elderly, and even people who believe they've been abducted by space aliens. Or report improbable memories of a previous life. All of these groups of people, as well as young children, are probably more likely to confuse their imaginations with reality. Many other memory errors reflect confusion in source monitoring. Take the phenomenon of cryptomnesia, literally meaning hidden memory, whereby we mistakenly forget that one of our ideas originated with someone else. Some cases of plagiarism probably reflect cryptomnesia. When the late George Harrison, a former member of the Beatles, wrote his hit song My Sweet Lord, he apparently forgot that the melody of the song was virtually identical to that of the Chiffons' song He's So Fine, which had appeared about 10 years earlier. After the copyright owners of the Chiffons song sued Harrison, he used cryptomnesia as a legal defense, arguing that he mistakenly believed he'd invented the melody himself. The judge awarded money to the copyright owners of the original song, although he ruled that Harrison probably didn't commit the plagiarism intentionally. Implanting false memories in the lab. Nearly 4 decades ago, pioneering psychologist Elizabeth Loftus opened researchers' eyes to the dramatic effects of misleading suggestions on both everyday memories and eyewitness reports. She found that suggestive memory techniques, procedures that strongly encourage people to recall memories, often create recollections that were never present to begin with. Her classic work demonstrated that our memories are far more malleable than most psychologists had assumed. Misinformation effect. In a famous study, Loftus and John Palmer, 1974, showed participants brief clips of traffic accidents and asked them to estimate the speed of the vehicles involved. They varied the wording of the question. About how fast were the cars going when they, each other, by inserting different words in the blank, like contacted, hit, bumped, collided, and smashed. When the inserted word suggested a greater degree of contact between the cars, participants reported higher speeds. For example, when participants heard the word smashed, they rated the speed as 9 miles per hour faster than when they heard the word contacted. 40.8 when smashed was used versus 31.8 when contacted was used. In a second study, Loftus and Palmer replicated these findings by using the words hit and smashed, and a week later asked participants if they recalled seeing any broken glass at the scene. Sure enough, compared with those who heard the hit word, participants who heard the smashed word more often reported seeing glass. In a later study, Loftus and her colleagues asked participants to watch a slide sequence of an accident in which a car passed through an intersection and struck a pedestrian. They asked participants questions about the event. Some of the questions contained misleading suggestions. For example, in the actual slide sequence, the sign at the intersection was a yield sign. Yet Loftus and her colleagues phrased one of the questions, while the car was stopped at the stop sign, did a red Datsun pass by? Afterward, participants who received the misleading questions were more likely to say that the sign was a stop sign than a yield sign. In contrast, most participants who didn't receive the phony information recalled the yield sign accurately. This phenomenon is a well-replicated misinformation effect. Providing people with misleading information after an event can lead to fictitious memories. Older adults are particularly vulnerable to misinformation effects, partly due to difficulties with source monitoring. Lost in the Mall and Other Implanted Memories. Loftus's famous Lost in the Mall study demonstrates that we can implant elaborate memories of a made-up event that never happened. Loftus and her colleagues asked the relatives of 24 participants to describe events that the participants had experienced in childhood. Then they presented participants with a booklet that contained the details of 3 events the relatives reported, along with a 4th event that the relatives verified had never occurred: being lost in a shopping mall as a child. Participants wrote about each event they could recall. In follow-up interviews, a quarter of participants claimed to distinctly remember being lost in the mall as a child. Some even provided surprisingly detailed accounts of the event. Many investigators followed in the path of Loftus's groundbreaking work. Using suggestive questions and statements, researchers have successfully implanted memories of a wide variety of events in about 20 to 25% of college students, ranging from accidentally spilling a bowl of punch on the parents of the bride at a wedding reception, to surviving a serious animal attack, to being bullied in childhood, to committing a major crime. Do participants' reports in false memory studies reflect actual changes in their memories? Or could the reports merely reflect demand characteristics, attempts to please experimenters or give experimenters the answers participants believe they're seeking? CLO 2.2c. Probably not, because even when researchers have told participants they implanted the memories, many continue to insist that the memories are genuine. Moreover, the fact that many investigators, using different experimental designs, have replicated the findings that memories are malleable provides strong support for the claim that memory is reconstructive. Event plausibility. As we might imagine, there are limits to how far we can go in implanting false memories. How likely is it you could be convinced that you won the lottery or an international trivia contest last year? Not likely, we suspect. That's because it is easier to implant a memory of something that's plausible than something that isn't. In addition, it is easier to implant a fictitious memory of an event from the distant past for which we have hazy or no recall than of an event from the recent past we are likely to remember. Memories of impossible or implausible events. Most of the studies we've reviewed are open to at least one major criticism. Perhaps participants actually experienced the suggested event, such as being lost in a mall, but forgot about it until the suggestion reminded them of it. Studies of impossible or highly implausible memories rule out this alternative hypothesis. Indeed, researchers have devised clever existence proofs, CLO 2.2a, demonstrating that it's possible to create elaborate memories of events that never happened, often by providing participants with information that increases the event's plausibility. Here are some memorable examples. In one study, investigators showed participants ads for Disneyland that featured Bugs Bunny and asked them about seeing bugs at Disneyland as a child. 16% of participants said they remembered meeting and shaking hands with Bugs Bunny. Some even remembered hearing him say, "What's up, Doc?" What's so strange about that? Bugs Bunny is a Warner Brothers, not a Disney cartoon character, so the memories must have been false. In another study, researchers provided Italian undergraduate students with false newspaper articles, implying that cases of demonic possession were more common in their culture than previously thought, thereby increasing the plausibility of such an event. After receiving this fictional information, 18% of the students came to believe that they probably had witnessed a demonic possession. Herndon and colleagues set up a situation in which the experimenter increased the plausibility of an early childhood event. In this case, a potentially painful medical procedure involving injecting dye into the bladder, by training student confederates to pretend to recall the event in a group setting with the participant, and for the participant to engage in guided imagery to attempt to recall the procedure. 75% of individuals who both participated in the group and the guided imagery exercise reported a false memory of the event that contained details of the event not suggested initially. How do these studies of plausibility relate to the story of Nadine Cool? By using techniques that suggested or implied that she experienced horrific abuse, for example, her therapist made such events seem plausible. Ms. Cool eventually came to believe they occurred in reality. Consider that many therapists who treat patients with suspected sexual abuse histories prescribe survivor books, self-help books that often contain checklists of supposed telltale symptoms of past sexual abuse, such as fears of sex, low self-esteem, insecurity about one's appearance, or excessive dependency. Yet research shows that most of these symptoms are so vague and general that they can apply to virtually everyone, raising the possibility that consumers of such books might mistakenly, yet plausibly, conclude that their personality characteristics are indicative of a history of sexual abuse. Generalizing from the lab to the real world. Suggestions can affect not only memory, but also our preferences and behaviors. Consider what's known as the asparagus study. The researchers provided participants with the suggestion that they loved to eat asparagus as children. Participants who received this suggestion became more confident that they liked asparagus the first time they'd tried it, compared with participants who received no such suggestion. After participants acquired these new false beliefs, they reported an increased liking for asparagus, a greater desire to eat asparagus in a restaurant, and a willingness to pay more for asparagus in the grocery store. In another study, investigators suggested to some participants that they'd become ill in childhood after eating egg salad. Later on, these participants ate significantly fewer egg salad sandwiches than participants who didn't receive this suggestion, even up to 4 months later. Children are especially vulnerable to suggestions to recall events that didn't occur, probably because they often confuse fantasy with reality. In one study, researchers implanted memories in children of having been abducted by a UFO by providing them with newspaper articles suggesting that such experiences are relatively common. Younger children, 7 to 8 years old, were more likely to report memories of being abducted than were children 11 to 12 years old. Stephen Sessi and his colleagues asked preschool children to imagine real and fictitious events. Once a week, for a total of 7 to 10 interviews, they instructed children to think real hard about whether the events had occurred. For example, they asked the children to try to remember made-up events, like going to the hospital with a mousetrap on their fingers. 58% of children generated stories regarding at least one of these fictitious events. Interestingly, about a quarter of the children continued to insist that their memories were real, even when their parents and the experimenter assured them that the events never happened. These findings are important because many social workers and police officers who suspect that a child was abused question him or her about this abuse repeatedly. Repeated questioning comes with a risk. Children may give investigators the answers they're seeking, even if the answers are wrong. Psychologists and other healthcare workers should therefore use less suggestive procedures when questioning children. Indeed, most research demonstrates that many children can provide reasonably accurate memories when they're simply asked about an event once in a non-leading fashion. For example, "Can you tell me what happened?" Still, we should be cautious about generalizing experimental findings to the real world, because these laboratory studies may be low in external validity. CLO 2.2a. Ethical limitations render it difficult, if not impossible, to determine whether we can implant memories of sexual and physical abuse inside or outside the laboratory. Yet research on false memories raises the possibility that memory errors bear important implications for real-world situations, like eyewitness identifications. Do they? Eyewitness testimony. As of this writing, 344 prisoners have been acquitted of a crime and released because their DNA didn't match genetic material left by perpetrators. These former prisoners have served a total of 4,685 years. Consider Jean Bibbins, number 125, sentenced to life imprisonment for the sexual assault of a 16-year-old girl. The victim described the perpetrator as a man with long, curly hair, wearing jeans, even though Bibbins had cropped hair at the time and was wearing shorts. Still, she identified Bibbins as the assailant. Years later, investigators located a biological specimen, and genetic testing confirmed that Bibbins' DNA didn't match the DNA at the crime scene. After maintaining his innocence for 16 years, Bibbins walked out of prison a free man. If there's a thread that ties Bibbins to the more than 300 other unjustly imprisoned individuals, it's that an eyewitness misidentified him as guilty. More than 70% of prisoners acquitted by DNA testing are identified mistakenly by eyewitnesses, and in about a third of cases by 2 or more eyewitnesses. The fact that eyewitness misidentification is the most common cause of wrongful convictions isn't so surprising when we consider that when witnesses seem sure they've identified a culprit, juries tend to believe them. Even attorneys and judges are unduly influenced by confident yet inaccurate eyewitness testimony. Contrary to popular misconception, the correlation between witnesses' confidence and the accuracy of their testimony is often modest. Still, the accuracy of eyewitness identification is considerably higher when it's assessed at the time of the initial identification, probably because eyewitness memories, like other memories, become progressively distorted with the passage of time. Eyewitnesses sometimes provide invaluable evidence, especially when they have ample time to observe the perpetrator under good lighting conditions, when the criminal isn't disguised, and when little time elapses between witnessing the crime and identifying the guilty party. But eyewitness testimony is far from accurate when these optimal conditions aren't met. Moreover, eyewitness testimony is less likely to be accurate when people observe individuals of races different from their own, when they talk to other witnesses, when they catch only a brief glimpse of the criminal, or when they view a crime under stressful circumstances, such as when they feel threatened. Sometimes eyewitnesses also mistake someone they've seen shortly before the crime for the actual criminal. Eyewitness accuracy is also often impaired by weapon focus. When a crime involves a weapon, people understandably tend to focus on the weapon rather than the perpetrator's appearance. Psychologists can play a critical role in educating jurors about the science of eyewitness recall so that they can better weigh the evidence. The false memory controversy. One of the most divisive controversies in all of psychology centers on the possibility that memories of child abuse and other traumatic experiences can be shaped by suggestive techniques in psychotherapy. In fact, debates concerning false memories became so bitter that some writers have referred to them as the memory wars. Although the fires of the war have dimmed since the 1990s, the embers still burn, and differences persist regarding the nature of false memories. On one side of the battle are memory recovery therapists, who claim that patients repress memories of traumatic events, such as childhood sexual abuse, and then recover them years, even decades later. As we'll learn later in this text, most followers of Sigmund Freud believe that repression is a form of forgetting, in which people push painful memories into their unconscious. According to recovered memory therapists, these repressed memories are the root cause of current life problems that must be addressed to make progress in psychotherapy. Some, like Nadine Kuhl's therapist, claim that their clients have repressed memories of murderous satanic cults, even though investigations by the FBI have consistently failed to unearth any evidence of the cults. By the mid-1990s, approximately 25% of psychotherapists in the United States and the United Kingdom reported in surveys that they used 2 or more potentially suggestive procedures, including dream interpretation, repeated questioning, guided imagery, and hypnosis, to help patients who had no recollection of sexual abuse to recover memories of it. More recent data from Canada point to similar numbers, suggesting that these techniques are still widely used in many quarters. Although undergraduates and psychotherapists have expressed increased skepticism regarding repressed memory since the 1990s, as many as 66% to nearly 80% of undergraduates and clinicians continue to believe that memories are permanently stored, and that traumatic memories are often repressed and recoverable in treatment. Lined up on the opposing side of the false memory debate is a chorus of researchers who claim that there's slim evidence that people repress traumatic memories, including childhood sexual abuse. These researchers point to a mounting body of evidence that painful memories, such as memories of the Holocaust, are well remembered and, if anything, remembered too well. According to them, there's serious reason to doubt that many memories can be repressed and then recovered years or decades later. These researchers have also voiced serious concerns about whether suggestive procedures can lead patients to conclude erroneously that family members abused them in childhood. Indeed, hundreds of individuals have been separated from their families, and in some cases even imprisoned, solely on the basis of recovered memory claims of child sexual abuse. According to this perspective, at least some memory recovery techniques can cause harm. From a scientific and ethical standpoint, this state of affairs is deeply troubling, often tragic. Given what we now know about how fallible human memory is, recovered memories of child abuse shouldn't be trusted completely unless they're accompanied by clear-cut corroborating evidence. In the past decade or so, a consensus has emerged that suggestive procedures can create false memories of childhood events in many psychotherapy clients. Learning tips. Getting the science of memory to work for us. As we've learned throughout this chapter, our memories are remarkable, yet far from perfect. Many of our memories interfere with each other or fade with the passage of time. Our schemas can bias our memories of events, and misleading information, such as leading questions, can lead us to remember occurrences that never happened. But none of this should lead us to despair. Indeed, as the story of Joshua 4 teaches us, even ordinary people can acquire extraordinary memories in at least some domains. 4 was a reporter with a perfectly normal memory who decided to see how much he could enhance his recall using mnemonic devices, including the method of loci. After a solid year of training, 4 won the U.S. Memory Championship, memorizing, among other things, the exact order of a full deck of 52 cards in 1 minute and 40 seconds. Although few of us have the time or determination of 4 to become memory whizzes, there's good news. The science of memory we've encountered in this chapter can help us learn material and study more effectively and efficiently. So, drawing on what we've learned, we leave you with a set of evidence-based tips to bear in mind as you study the material in this course and other courses. These tips will be helpful for acquiring and consolidating your memories not only in college but also in everyday life. 1. Distributed versus massed study. Spread out your study time, review your notes, and textbook in increments rather than cramming. 2. Testing effect. Put down what you've read and test yourself frequently on the material. 3. Elaborative rehearsal. Connect new knowledge with existing knowledge rather than Learning tips. Getting the science of memory to work for us. As we've learned throughout this chapter, our memories are remarkable, yet far from perfect. Many of our memories interfere with each other or fade with the passage of time. Our schemas can bias our memories of events, and misleading information, such as leading questions, can lead us to remember occurrences that never happened. But none of this should lead us to despair. Indeed, as the story of Joshua 4 teaches us, even ordinary people can acquire extraordinary memories in at least some domains. 4 was a reporter with a perfectly normal memory who decided to see how much he could enhance his recall using mnemonic devices, including the method of loci. After a solid year of training, 4 won the U.S. Memory Championship, memorizing, among other things, the exact order of a full deck of 52 cards in 1 minute and 40 seconds. Although few of us have the time or determination of 4 to become memory whizzes, there's good news. The science of memory we've encountered in this chapter can help us learn material and study more effectively and efficiently. So drawing on what we've learned, we leave you with a set of evidence-based tips to bear in mind as you study the material in this course and other courses. These tips will be helpful for acquiring and consolidating your memories not only in college but also in everyday life. 1. Distributed versus massed study. Spread out your study time, review your notes and textbook in increments rather than cramming. 2. Testing effect. Put down what you've read and test yourself frequently on the material. 3. Elaborative rehearsal. Connect new knowledge with existing knowledge rather than simply memorizing facts or names. 4. Levels of processing. Work to process ideas deeply and meaningfully. Avoid taking notes word for word from instructors' lectures or slides. Try capturing the information in your own words and using other concepts from the course. 5. Mnemonic devices. The more reminders or cues you can connect from your knowledge base to new material, the more likely you are to recall new material, including the material you learned in this chapter. Summary. Memory. 7.1. How memory operates. The memory assembly line. 7.1a. Identify the ways that memories do and don't accurately reflect experiences. Memories can be surprisingly accurate over very long periods of time, but tend to be reconstructive rather than reproductive. 7.1b. Explain the function, span, and duration of each of the 3 memory systems. Sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory are stages of information processing that vary in how much information they hold and for how long they retain it. Short-term memory has a limited span of 7 plus or minus 2 items that can be extended by grouping things into larger, meaningful units called chunks. 7.1c. Differentiate the subtypes of long-term memory. Explicit memory subtypes include semantic and episodic memory. Implicit memory types include procedural and priming memory. 7.2. The 3 processes of memory. 7.2a. Identify methods for connecting new information to existing knowledge. Mnemonics are memory aids that link new information to more familiar knowledge. There are many kinds of mnemonics. They take effort to use but can assist recall. 7.2b. Identify the role that schemas play in the storage of memories. Schemas equip us with frames of reference for interpreting new situations. Nevertheless, they can sometimes lead to memory errors. 7.2c. Distinguish ways of measuring memory. Recall requires generating previously encountered information on our own, whereas recognition simply requires selecting the correct information from an array of choices. How quickly we relearn material previously learned and forgotten provides another measure of memory. 7.2d. Describe how the relation between encoding and retrieval conditions influences remembering. Individuals tend to remember better if they're tested under the same physical and emotional conditions as when they encoded the information. 7.3. The biology of memory. 7.3a. Describe the role of long-term potentiation in memory. Most scientists believe that long-term potentiation, a gradual strengthening of the connections among neurons from repetitive stimulation, plays a key role in the formation of memories and memory storage. 7.3b. Distinguish different types of amnesia and the relevance of amnesia to the brain's organization of memory. Evidence from studies of patients with amnesia demonstrates that there are distinct memory systems, because people with amnesia for declarative memory often still form new procedural memories. Retrograde amnesia causes forgetting of past experiences, whereas anterograde amnesia prevents us from forming memories of new experiences. 7.3c. Identify the key impairments of Alzheimer's disease. The memory loss of patients with Alzheimer's disease begins with that of recent events, with memories of events of the distant past typically being the last to go. Alzheimer's disease is marked by loss of synapses and acetylcholine neurons. 7.4. The development of memory. Acquiring a personal history. 7.4a. Identify how children's memory abilities change with age. Infants display implicit memory for events. Both infants' and children's memories are influenced by some of the same factors as adults' memory. Children's memory improves in part because of maturational changes in the brain that extend the span of memory. Over time, children become better able to use mnemonic and rehearsal strategies and become more aware of their memory limitations. 7.5. False memories. When good memory goes bad. 7.5a. Identify factors that influence people's susceptibility to false memories and memory errors. Flashbulb memories for highly significant events seem more crisp and vivid than do other memories, but may be just as vulnerable to errors as other kinds of memory. One source of memory errors is source monitoring difficulty. We can't always remember where or from whom we learned something, or whether it was a figment of our imagination, sometimes resulting in cryptomnesia. Our memories for events are easily influenced by suggestions from others that the events happened differently than our observations suggested. 7.5b. Describe some of the real-world implications of false memories and memory errors. The fact that we're receptive to suggestions about whether and how events took place bears important implications for children's memory and eyewitness testimony. Many scientists have argued that apparent recovered memories of early trauma may actually be due to the tendency of suggestive therapeutic procedures to induce false recollections. Chapter